session. This is session number 6 with Regis McKenna, and we're continuing today on the theme of the high-impact communications that Regis has done, and in particular was doing around the time period we were talking about, which was the 3 decades of the 70s, 80s, 90s. And I want to begin this morning, Regis, talking about the financial markets and the financial analysts. We've talked about your approach to market making and generating awareness, first of all, for these entirely new products that you were having to introduce, and entirely new companies as well. So can you talk a little bit about your approach to financial analysts, financial markets, and how you used your particular approach in helping them understand what was going on in technology?
Well, again, it's a long learning process. When that I've always seen everything that I've sort of done here in the Valley as one long education, and so each time each experience adds to the font of knowledge and the ability to reach back and grab some experiences. But having worked with both private as well as public companies, you begin to realize that the financial stability of the company becomes its strongest marketing tool. Because when, and I went through this with Tandem Computer and was looking at my notes last night from that period, and it's when I made some notations back, and they started in the 70s, but as they reached into the late 90s and the the late 80s and early 90s, they began having financial problems, largely due to some problems with their systems and a sale that they did to the California automobile, the drivers, what is it called? The DMV. Sorry, the drivers. Where they had acquired their software and their systems in order to manage that whole network of offices and data, and they had problems, and the state put that out publicly that they bought this system and it wasn't performing up to snuff, and it wasn't them, it was the other guy. And so we got into this kind of a situation. But those are the kind of vulnerabilities that, particularly when businesses are relying on certain systems and software to they need it for the execution of a business strategy and an ongoing sustaining business. When that looks like it's vulnerable, then competitors and customers begin to worry. They worry that, will this company survive? Will it be able to upgrade its software? Will it be able to move to the next generation? Will we get the kind of support that we want, or will they be cutting back in all kinds of areas? Because the first thing that happens is that there's a layoff. That frightens everybody. And if it's a public company that's out there, and people begin to worry. And then the questions start arising about it. We're even seeing this now with Tesla, right? I mean, it's now real questions about its financial viability. Those hurt, because then they've lost a lot of orders from customers because they're concerned about, will the support be there if I buy this car? And so those issues are, I think, the strongest marketing that a company has is to be profitable. Now, how does that come about in the marketplace? Well, financial analysts, and now today there are also bloggers and so forth who do a very good job of coming in and analyzing the company, or of pointing out the strengths and weaknesses of a business in the marketplace, because they're in the marketplace and they have they have no restrictions on who they can talk to. So when I started thinking about this, though, it was largely people like the Wall Street Journal or New York Times or Forbes, Fortune magazine, the ones that you could describe as being more financially oriented in their editorial work. And they would always quote analysts, or they would quote third parties. They would quote customers, and so forth. And so that became sort of a he said, you said kind of journalism that we still see today. But because the early, particularly when the business journalists got into started looking at technology, they didn't know the ins and outs of the technology businesses, so they relied on this sort of third party, particularly financial analysts who were putting out these financial reports on the industry and on businesses to give them guidance and give them insight and so forth. And so, and there are also some consulting firms and so forth that they did that too. And that became sort of highlighted. So the idea that I had was, let's go to those people and let's educate them before you go out and do any kind of press activity, so that when they do that, there's an understanding of what you're trying to accomplish already out there. And the only way to do that is that you do it personally, because there's not a lot of key analysts that cover any industry. There's maybe a handful at most. There's certainly those in Europe and in Asia, but by and large, there's probably no more than 15 or 20 people that you have to really get to know and to bring into your business and have them educated on what you're doing. Now, you have to have something real. It's not as though you're not selling them, because they have the wherewithal and the means to do the research to find out what's real. They will be talking to your competitors and they will be talking to your customers. So you can't, in a way, you can't get away with things there. Or if you can, it's very short-lived. So that whole process of understanding that and how that works and who looks to whom for credibility and knowledge, you have to figure that out ahead of time. And I used to say that 10% of the people out there, 10% of the press and the analysts influence the other 90%. And so it's sort of that pyramid might have a tall up here, but there's some stuff below the surface that are at work that are supporting the rest of it. And it used to be said that most newspapers pick up the New York Times in the morning and read what's going on and then report on it that night on their own, either local TVs or on their own local newspapers. So, and we see that as syndicated journalism now, as most local newspapers are filled with syndicated news. So it's not the way information is disseminated is through certain channels, and you have to understand who that is, and that's sort of the survivors who continue to put out news time after time, and they do it based upon, quite frankly, their profitability and wherewithal. So if they don't have the profitability, they don't have the reporters, they don't have the ability to do in-depth research and to get people out into the field. So, there are keystones that could come tumbling down, and that's the great fear we have today with the press, the printed press, is that the few of these keystones are falling. And because of the online advertising, and there's nobody on online advertising that's replacing that at this point except a lot of bloggers who could be anybody, anywhere, anytime, who declares that they want to analyze something. So it's becoming more and more obscure to do that today, whereas in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you could do it with a much cleaner plate.
Were there editors or publishers or analysts who really helped you, who made an impression on you, I would say, just by the way that they handled the ideas that you were bringing to them, especially in the early days of these technology companies?
Yeah, I mean, I got to know most of the journalists largely with not because of having any clients, but back, and particularly, I started it when I was with General Microelectronics, but particularly at National, I mentioned that Don Valentine gave me a lot of freedom to explore and do the things that I felt they had to do. And Charlie Spork once said that I got them to look much bigger and successful than they were. Largely, I spent time on the road going to visit these people and spending time with them and having, getting to know them, talking about things without any clients there, without having the influence of having to sell anything. and feeling more peer-to-peer, and as a result, I brought a lot of my own. I would bring materials, as you know, and show them things and be able to. I brought wafers and chips and even on the press release that we did for the first 8080, the first 8-bit microprocessor, I had reject chips pasted to every press release. So we sent out thousands of those with rejects. They didn't know they were rejects, but it was pasted on the front, so people could actually see what a microprocessor looked like. So
that must have had an impact.
It did. It became. People are still asking me for me today. I still have, I think, an envelope filled with a bunch of them. So people ask me, for them. And but sort of explaining how it worked. For example, the first electrically programmable and EEPROM. When you carry that, you can actually demonstrate what happens. You can see the chip. And there's a window in the top of the device. It was probably about an inch long, but in the top of the chip, the package was a little window that you put an ultraviolet light over, and it would erase the program. So then you could reprogram it. So well, later on, you could do that, by electronically. But that time, it was basically the first ones that were done. So they were pretty primitive. It was almost like taking an eraser to a blackboard or a whiteboard and erasing the chalk. So showing that sort of stuff, giving illustrations of it, and then, quite frankly, in a lot of instances, devising stories with these people. One of the key analysts was Ben Rosen, who was in New York at the time at Morgan Stanley. And before that, he was at a smaller public financial company, but he was a physicist, and so he knew he was able to figure out what was going on in these companies, particularly in the semiconductor industry. And there was Bob Henkel, who was at he was at electronics. And I think he originally was at the Wall Street Journal, and then he was at Electronics Magazine, and then he became managing editor of Electronics, and then Business Week. So it was McGraw-Hill Publications, so he moved up to that. And he and I became lifelong friends, and and he had no problem telling me, I was full of bull, or that I was, trying to sell my clients or things, and we would argue over that, even that point. But we got to be pretty close, in which we would talk about who are the good guys and the bad guys in the industry, and who can they trust and who can't they trust. There was a fellow at the Wall Street Journal named Dick Schaefer, who was part of that group. And sometimes we would have, there was about 5 of us that were various media and analysts that would have dinner in New York together, and talk about who's who, what's going on, and how are things going. And I mean, largely because I didn't feel that I was the one that had to actually tell a story about it. I wanted them to talk to the people in the company. I felt they didn't want, and I told Andy Grove this, they don't want to talk to me, they want to talk to you. So when you go to New York, here's a list of people that you should go have lunch with and get to know them. And in fact, he told me here in the hallway at the Computer Museum that that was the best advice he ever had, because Andy liked the media. He enjoyed going out and sort of educating people about what the business was about, and that became part of his modus operandi. And
he was very good at it too.
And he was excellent at it. And so, it was still very much a personal business at that time, and most of those people remained friends with me for long, long periods of time. And the editor of Electronic News, which was sort of people thought it was sort of a gossip sheet, but that's where Don Heffler, who was the person who covered the Valley here and who is credited with naming it Silicon Valley, I knew Don pretty well, but I knew his boss, Jerry Lydon, very well in New York because I had started calling on him years ago. And so, you know, Lydon would even call me to sort of check up on, is the story that Don's filing correct? I was invited into the I believe it was the Wall Street Journal. I was invited into their daily editorial session, in which they selected the stories that they were doing. Those kind of things, because I got to know the people really, really well, and they trusted me. I wasn't trying to BS them in any way whatsoever. I was trying to, certainly I was trying to present my client in a good light, but I felt the best way to do that was to not try to, not trying to manipulate them in any way. Here's the problem with the PR business in my mind, and why I always sort of hated it, and that is that I used to say PR needs a new image. Is that it's caught between, if you're a really good person with high integrity and you know your own self well, you're caught between the client who wants a particular outcome in the story and the media who realize that they have a free hand at looking and saying what they want to say. And those two worlds often, you know, conflict. So you run into the situation quite a bit where at the client level they don't understand why the media picks a certain subject or why they pick the competitor to put on the cover or to write a story about when they're better, or you know, they can justify why they should be there in that position. And you're dealing with people who never quite understood the First Amendment, let alone you know, why the media picks certain stories even whenever they feel they're technically far superior. And so the PR person's in the middle. And if you work in the company and you're in the PR person, you have little choice but to try to carry the message to the outside world. It's very hard to fight back internally. I put together a book on PR. I used to teach it to companies, and I put it together. The first place I gave it was at Tektronix in Portland. And the first chapter is Know Yourself. You know, from Socrates, that the first principle of living a real life is to know yourself. And you have to know yourself whenever you're in that business and be willing to challenge people and be willing to get fired, be willing to not be accepted or so you have to sort of educate people rather than make it a confrontational kind of thing. So that then led to the Evening With programs, which I had with all of the major newspapers and magazines, you know, Time, Fortune, Business Week, the Washington Post. Their top people, their top editors, in many cases they would bring their senior editors from around the world. And we would have a dinner that we would arrange here, and I, you know, it would be on my company's tab. Nobody paid for it other than us, and we'd have a dinner and bring, you know, Steve Jobs, Charlie Spork, Jerry Sanders, Bob Noyce, people like that, Don Valentine, people from the analyst world, people, and they would sit with the journalists, and we had Mrs. Graham from the Washington Post came with her whole staff, the deal was that the journalists can ask you questions and you can ask them questions, but nothing can be printed. And that was an agreement up front. You could never get that today. People were surprised that we got it then. But it was the industry out here was rising, and they were curious about it. And if that's what they had to do it, I mean, they would go back in later and find out more detail and publish stories. But out of that particular meeting, I wanted it to be really open and for both people to get to understand, we're doing our job, and you know, and here's how we ought to meet in the middle.
So these were called an evening with ...
Right.
And the audience in the dinner party and that on those evenings were primarily journalists?
No, the audience, there was no audience.
I mean, not an audience, but the
people at dinner were
purpose of the dinner was
were the electronic industry.
Yes.
And I didn't just invite clients. I invited usually the president or the senior person at companies that I knew and were in the area here. So if you go down the list, I have a couple of the lists that you can go down and you'll say, are these all clients? And they weren't. I would say half of them are clients, half of them aren't.
The purpose was for them to get to hear someone else up close for an extended period. Would you talk to them? Would it be a Q&A, a sort of a discussion?
No, it was a
format?
Q&A. It was asking questions and then getting into conversations. I remember when Mrs. Graham brought her editorial staff, the Japanese were the issue, and could the American the American basically consumer electronics had vanished from our shores and had gone to the Far East, and it was sort of assumed that a lot of the technologies and companies that were here, including Apple and others, would all end up being made somewhere in Asia, and the companies would come back here. I mean, this is what happened to so many companies during that era, from steel to video recording. And so she had just come from Japan. They in fact stopped at this dinner on their way back from Japan, and they were really interested in hearing the voices of what people thought here. So it got into an active discussion on that back and forth, and people were participating, and so most of them ended up in discussions among very open, they were really outstanding sessions, and it was to simply get to realize that the journalists are curious people about your business and about your industry, and they're not trying to help you by marketing your company. They're trying to understand what's going on so they can communicate that to a broader public.
And how did that go? Did they leave that evening with a deeper understanding of what the concerns were?
I didn't do any follow-up specifically, but over time, these sessions lasted maybe, I think we went probably about 3 to 5 years, and over time doing different kinds of sessions like that, I think it made a lot of headway. I mean, I have people still today talk about it. One of the issues that we ran into was so many of the companies that were spin-offs here were suing each other, and so we would sit down and we'd say, oh no, we can't put him next to him. Because,
so seating became an issue.
So we spent quite a bit of time. I had an assistant, Gail Holste, who worked for me for about 25 years, and she was very good at putting these organized together, and she would sort of see that everybody was happy, but that they were not necessarily sitting next to somebody that they were in court battling over.
The understanding that the analysts and the people you were trying to influence had of the importance of this industry and what Silicon Valley was doing must have changed substantially, like when the devices started actually sitting on their desks. I mean, when they started having their own computers and their own laptops and so forth. Was that a moment when suddenly a lot of people said, okay, now this is a thing. This is not just a line of business.
I think there were two seminal events. I think the microprocessor was a significant event because it changed the way companies designed their products. It changed the time to market. It changed so that more innovations could come out, and that was fairly understandable because it was a computer on a chip, and so it went into everything. And I think we did an ad on that, from blood analyzers to video games, and so now they began to have a lot more applications that they could look at as where is this going on, and so a lot of the stories that appeared were about putting this kind of device inside of various types of medical instrumentation or things that you could relate with, and video games and so forth. certainly the personal computer was a revolution to the world of media. Because they were not only using it on themselves, many of them, but it was an experimentation for them to use it. But that gave them a certain feeling of, well, I can evaluate this because I'm using it for my work daily, and which is what you told me I could do. And if it didn't work right, they could report on that as well. And so a lot of the journalists, in fact, a number of the journalists became sort of industry gurus to put on conferences themselves and wrote a column on the technology exclusively. That all emerged as and most of those people, I know one who began his life as a sports editor and ended up writing exclusively on electronics. I mean, they grew too, and they expanded their knowledge. And they were there at the beginning, and they were using these first machines. So they were able to look critically upon as a user, as well as an outside observer. And remember, this was a day when people did read, more than the soundbite, because it was the only. The internet. Don't forget, didn't come in until I think it was commercialized in 91 or 92. So this was all through the 80s that this was going on. The media, the printed media, had a big impact on, the computer had a big impact on them.
Did you find the periods around the IPOs of your major clients like Intel and Apple, were those periods that called upon you and your company to do particular things that you found innovative, or that were a different way to think about a public offering?
Well, largely it was what we didn't do. Because even in the first work that we were doing with Steve Jobs, I think I even have that on tape somewhere. Our conversations with him was, we can't say this publicly because we're getting, Apple was preparing for the public offering. So lawyers started coming into these meetings. I remember the first time lawyers came into the meetings that we were working on Intel's quarterly reports, and we worked on their first annual report. All of a sudden, lawyers showed up, and so you could. There were things you couldn't say. It was more not what you could say; it's what you couldn't say, and that always became sort of a restriction. I didn't like that very much, because. And neither did most of the people that were, say, in the creative side of the business, because that really put a stop sign in the way of their creativity, and they wanted some of the lawyers wanted to put all the exceptions and all of the denials at the bottom of the press releases and things like that. And it's like sending out and saying this, but then they get a paragraph at the end that says, but don't believe this entirely, So, I mean, it just put the opposite kind of stamp on it. So we started getting into a lot of that as things went on. Then there were firms that started specializing in financial PR, and that was not something that I felt that the financial aspects it was always, from my standpoint, the credibility of the product and the market. And if that were strong and the company were profitable, then the financial markets would take care of themselves. There were classes of clients, for example, biotech clients, and companies were going into the pharmaceutical business like Genentech. After the sort of launch of the technology and launch of the product, there really wasn't any need for us, because it was then 5 to 10 years before you get FDA approval and that long process really meant that there was nothing, you couldn't promote anything. You really couldn't go out and speak a lot about these kinds of products to the public because there were lots of restrictions on them until you had something really viable. I even got beat up for the initial announcements of the first products at Genentech. I got calls from people at science magazines and places like that telling me that I should not have done that. I mean, directly to just volunteering that, hey, they beat me up on the phone because you only do this kind of thing once you've had peer reviews, and once it's been reviewed by the FDA and things like that.
What had you said that upset them so much?
There was two articles. One was in Business Week and one was in the Wall Street Journal. That I think I gave you copies of those.
Yeah, I was just sitting here thumbing through the papers from last time. There's an article here about, from Business Week, December 12th, 1977, a commercial debut for DNA technology.
Right.
And it talked about Genentech synthesizing this brain hormone, somatostatin. And it was cast as a business story because obviously it was Business Week, and
right.
It was in the research. It's actually labeled in the research section of the magazine that week. So it seemed, the reason I asked the question, what did you said, we'll put this in the oral history. Reading it now, almost 40 years later, it seems like a perfectly straightforward business article.
Right. But at the time, they were comparing it to a pharmaceutical company who announces a drug before it's really out there and in the marketplace, or before it's been approved by the FDA. And I think that offended a lot of people and sent up warning signs. It also sent out a lot of speculation about people who then saw this as, creating new kinds of life, creating, then you could really, designer animals, designer people, all of that stuff. So there were the fringe people out there who began writing all kinds of things on the other side. And there were a couple instances. I mean, I think at Genentech, it had a really positive effect in that Lilly saw the article. I think they saw the article in the Wall Street Journal, which appeared before the Business Week one, or roughly around the same time, and actually that caused them to come visit Genentech, and then they created they licensed the molecule that they were developing for insulin, and so that directly led to the creation of a partnership that helps sustain Genentech as a small company. Because one of the issues was, here's a small company that is developing what would eventually become drugs for diabetics, for certain kinds of diseases. I think the next one was growth hormone that they were working on, and so that was usually done by big companies, and so the credibility of a small company, when Lilly made a deal with them, suddenly they had the backing of a major pharmaceutical company who, quite frankly, had something like 80 or 90% of the insulin market worldwide. So as they were coming out with that, they then had this alliance and license, I guess, agreement with them. So it gave them a lot of stability. On the other hand, there was a company that I was on the board of, actually. It was also a client called Hanna. They were in the East Bay, and they were developing and cloning the islets of Langerhans, which grow insulin cells inside the pancreas. And they were trying to grow these and clone them in a largely in what would be called Petri dishes type of thing. And they were in various degrees of success with that, but then the Reagan administration came in, and and they put a stop to any kind of research on new forms of anything that smelled of new forms of life in the lab, and cloning of human cells, because they were using fetal cells. And the way the fetal cells were acquired was through not in any illegal way, but usually through people that had miscarriages and those kinds of things, and they were using those kinds of cells. And in fact, I even wrote for them a code of ethics on how they handle that. I mean, you know, I suggested that to them, and we did that, and we published that.
Was that the first time you had done something like that?
Well, I knew a little bit about ethics. I mean, you know, I took a lot of courses in it in college and things like that. So, yes. But it was something in which, you know, they needed, and it became sort of something that they could at least show to the analysts. But in fact, people just stopped investing in them, and so they were not able to get the funding that they needed to sustain their work.
Was it an ethical question for the investors?
No, but that issue was raised by people out, you know, particularly in the media, and because it was cloning human life, and I think it was largely around the whole idea of using fetal cells. Now they do the same thing, but they actually use human cells that you can extract from the body. Without, you know, having to have anything. But at that time, the fetal cell was thought to be a pure cell that you could use to clone, and it was, at least at that time. It probably would have evolved over time to something better, but because the problem with that was that the antibodies, type 1 diabetes is that the cells, the mechanism making the cells is attacked by antibodies of your own body creation. So you had to have some encapsulated way of growing these cells and then keeping them from protected. And that's a long process of trial and experiment. And they were well into that. They had scientists. They were moving along, and they were being funded. But then that funding dried up once the government said, we're not going to fund any of those kind of projects.
Since we're into this subject matter now, and it's early in the session and we're both fresh, I thought it might be interesting to talk about Genentech now.
Yeah.
I had it deeper in the outline, but let's talk about Genentech now, and Genentech and your relationship with the founders. Can you just talk about how that all got started, and then let's talk about your experience with Genentech.
Yeah, and it was really a brief period of time. It was around the same time as Apple.
We're talking early 80s.
But we're talking 1970, 78.
78,
yeah.
77, 78,
yeah.
yeah.
And, it was largely because Bob Swanson, who was a junior partner at Kleiner Perkins, and a lot of my clients were from Kleiner Perkins, or we worked very closely. I knew Tom from pretty much the first time he set up Kleiner Perkins, and did a lot of work for Gene Kleiner, and things that I wouldn't have normally done, I did for Gene Kleiner. He had some strange investments, I mean, he had good investments, but he also had some strange ones, like tennis shoes and tennis rackets and things like that. But anyway, and so Bob Swanson called me, and at the time, he had left Kleiner, and it's always been a question as to why he left. I think there was some issue with Tom Perkins. I think Perkins was a man of quick judgment, and Bob was I believe Bob was a chemistry major in college. He had some background in this, but I think there was somehow or other he wasn't finding the deals that he needed to find, or something of that nature. And so the junior partner's role at Kleiner was that you come, you do a good job, and you can keep it, or you can grow within the partnership. But if you don't produce enough, and there's some consensus among the people there that you're not doing it, or Tom Perkins had an opinion, who sort of overweight everybody else's, then you'd just move on to something else, and they bring in a new batch of graduates. These people are usually from various graduate schools, Bob was one of those people, and he still was very persistent, and he was working out of the Wells Fargo offices built in San Francisco at the time, and he was working on a plan. And so when I met with him, that was the first place I met with him, was up there. He had talked about this research in this recombinant DNA area, and that he found the person who had been really working on this over a long period of time. I guess there were two people. There was Herb Boyer at UCSF, and there was, and I don't remember his first name, but it's Cohen, who was at Stanford. And he went to visit Herb at UCSF, who was in the research area working on this project, had a lab there, and they got along, and they talked about what the potential would be for it. So now Bob had to put it into a business plan, and I had several meetings with him in which we just went over how do you write up a business plan for this, and what markets, because we wanted to identify markets that were growth markets. And I remember at the time they even, and it's in those articles Bob mentions, industrial uses, which that never came about because beer would be an industry. It's grown in a process of fermentation, and it's cloned, if you will, through yeast. And so this was sort of like a yeast. You put it into a bacteria, and the bacteria would multiply, and then they'd kill off the bacteria, and you'd have the molecule that you wanted left there, and that's how you grow it. But to do that, first you had to you had to manipulate the gene and the basic component, and that's where recombinant DNA, where you could take the DNA apart and recombine it into a molecule that looked like an insulin molecule, and then put it into this E. coli, I think was the manufacturer, and they put it into E. coli, and that would multiply and grow the insulin, and then they would basically kill off the E. coli, and you had the insulin left, purify it. And so he went through this whole process and worked on the business plan and so forth, and then I do know that he asked me to see if I could sort of help patch things up with Tom Perkins, which I remember calling Tom and suggesting that things look promising here. They've got some ideas and some products and things, and that's how Tom then got involved. And
I was just noticing, just to interject here, thumbing through this article again, Bob Swanson was only 30 years old at the time. Man, he was still a very young guy.
He was a very young guy. He was also, he was very smart. He knew what he wanted, but he was also very shy. He was also a shy person. He was not. He wasn't, he wasn't a Steve Jobs kind of character. He wasn't out there able to, sort of market things the way. Privately, he was very good. But Bob was a methodical, a structured kind of person, and
we'll put this this picture in the oral history, but you can just look at Bob Swanson in this photograph and see the very guy that you're describing.
Yeah. He was a really wonderful person, and now Herb, he told me about Herb in some of our early meetings, and he gave me a copy of Herb's Vitae, his resume, and I looked down it, and I saw that he had attended St. Vincent's College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, And I kind of sat up and I said, I went there. And so he was there a couple years ahead of me, I think. He probably overlapped, I think, by 1 or 2 years. And I only went 2 years there and transferred to Duquesne University. But we overlapped, I think, by about a year or two. But I certainly didn't know him. So I went back and I went home, and I had one yearbook from those days, and that happened to have his picture in it
and
as
there
a
he
senior.
was.
And there he was. And I mean, he looked like a cherub, I told him, and he had a very skinny black tie, as it was that era. It was in the late 50s. And so I had a poster I blew that picture up into about this big, on a poster.
From the yearbook?
From the yearbook. Yeah, well, I know I had the art department put Time magazine on the top. So it was his picture on the front of Time magazine, and blew it up very big and rolled it up. And so we were going to meet at a lunch in San Francisco. And I brought that along. And I think probably for the first part of the lunch, we were just getting to know each other, talking back and forth about what he was doing in his lab and so forth and so on. And I think he probably thought, why do we need this guy, Because he was a scientist, and this was his sort of exposure to somebody who was saying, how to market a product. It was far afield from what he had seen before. And so as we got into lunch, I said, Herb, if this pans out, you're going to become very famous. And so I said, so I took the liberty of showing you what that's going to look like. So I spread out this picture with the picture of the Time, and he literally fell out of his chair. I mean, he just went back. He said, "Where the hell did you get that?" And so then I went through the story, and we became pretty good friends after that. And
was that the first time he knew you and he were both alums of St. Vincent's?
Yeah. He didn't know me from the Man in the Moon. I mean, again, a really, really outstanding person. And he said he told me later that he put it up in the lab and people used it to throw darts at. So his people that worked around him. And he later went back on the board of St. Vincent's, so he stayed very much involved. He's from Derry, Pennsylvania. It's a small town, farm town out in west. It's about 50 miles, 60 miles northeast of Pittsburgh, and he continues to go back there and support, I think, places and things back in those old days.
It always struck me. I didn't know either of them personally, but just watching video and seeing pictures and interviews of the two of them, it was interesting. It was almost a role reversal in a way, because Bob, even though he had come out of venture capital and was helping to really shape this business, was the more shy, quiet, retiring guy, as you said. Boyer, the scientist, who you might have expected to be more retiring and shy, was a kind of a he was a talker. He was a big thinker. He seemed to really like the limelight, or at least he didn't run from it once he was thrust into it. Is that the way it was?
Yeah, but I find that's true of a lot of the scientists and engineers and people who work in management. The engineers, particularly those who sort of drive certain technologies or products in some way, they're very articulate about them, and they're also very articulate about what the potential uses are and where they see the next and the next and the next generation. And I mean, I never shied from taking input from people on the technical or science side, because they really had a lot of vision about where the business could go and had their own ideas. And I think the more time I spent with them, the more you realize that. Having that strong technical team, that strong, I mean, in some cases it was science-driven, particularly in the biotech world. they really do have they are able to articulate their science in a way that, that a lot of times the people in the management can't, or even the marketing people can't. So I actually loved that part of the business, and that was true with both of them. But aside from somatostatin, and then the big one was insulin, and the fact that Lilly put in a sort of a prototype manufacturing facility within. There's a mini lab, a mini processing lab, and I remember going in and watching them put it together. And it just looked like one of these things out of the movies where all the tubes and the distillation process. In fact, it looked like I think a huge complex still, but it got them to know. It really taught Genentech how to get into the business. So that alliance, and that sort of again goes to a lesson that I again sort of picked up, was that these alliances that you have with larger companies when you're a small company really teaches you things. It teaches you how to get into a larger environment, how to scale, how to develop distribution, how to think about the next levels of change and growth. And you see that sometimes from it, and sometimes it's a negative thing. You make an alliance and you see inside a company, you see how they're doing it wrong, and so you're able to emulate that, but do away with the bad stuff and do it in a good way. But still, you learn some from having that partnership, and I think that's what the early stages of Genentech really was having that partnership that enabled them to see what they would look like 2, 3, 5, 10 years from then, and Lilly was a pretty buttoned up company.
Yeah. When you first encountered them, did they fully understand what they had in being able to actually make the recombinant DNA process work with these hormones and these synthetic drugs?
Well, Boyer was able to do it in a lab, and that sometimes it can be seen as an artifact. You have to actually put it into production to see if the same process can be done over and over and over again, and that's true with a lot of materials and chemical-based businesses. Is that it's I had one fellow scientist tell me that too many of the innovations that we read about are done by Hollywood scientists, and what he meant by that was that they get a breakthrough in a lab setting, in a small experiment, and then they announce to the world what they can do. And they do that in order to get more funding, not to necessarily reproduce that. But it's really not a viable product or a viable to take to the. So you're basically in research, and you're trying to move into development. And to move it into development means you have to repeat that in a process that takes you to volumes and so forth. And I think they probably knew that intellectually, that's what they had to do, but neither Herb nor Bob had worked in a large pharmaceutical company or a large chemical company, but they certainly intellectually knew the process and could forecast it. But I think with most of these companies, and again, we've talked about this before, they learn by doing. And part of the doing was helping and working alongside, say, the Lilly people who were helping to build that first prototype production operation.
When they got exposure to the Lilly processes you were talking about, what was their reaction? How did they adapt to it?
Well, they because insulin was going to demand a lot of volumes of business, they felt they couldn't grow that fast, so they licensed that to Lilly. But the next drug, which developed after, actually we were no longer doing business with them a few years later, was the human growth hormone. And that was produced in relatively small volumes. There was a thing called the Infant Drug Act, and what it allowed for was that if you produced a molecule or a drug for an illness or that had a limited market, that was a small number of people. I don't remember how many, but let's say the total of maybe 100,000 people or something like that. Then you were able to get certain government assistance, or you were able to avoid certain taxes, or you were actually protected in that patent for a longer period of time. There were benefits to that. It was called the Infant Drug Act, I think, or Orphan Drug Act. It was called the Orphan Drug Act, and probably not a very good name for it, but that was what it was called. I have a copy of it actually. So that's what they could get involved with the growth hormone and have a certain exclusivity on the patents that they developed in that area for a certain period of time. So it gave them protection from competition to come in and, drive the prices and lower.
Yeah. I want to ask you about.
Incidentally, I should say that the promise of creating insulin through recombinant DNA process, the promise was that it would reduce the cost of insulin. So as you know, I've been a type 1 diabetic for most of my life, 60 years. And when I first started using insulin, I think it was something like $10 a bottle, maybe $5. It's $300 today, $300. So it's it's very expensive. It didn't reduce the cost. It actually the extra money that's been added onto it is really it's actually cheaper because you're making it in high volumes to make, but it's more expensive to buy.
It's so interesting you should say that, because I was just about to read you the two sentences out of this 1977 piece was kind of Genentech's coming out party that struck me. One was the lead, which is a tiny San Francisco company just 2 years old, has scored a biomedical research coup that may have left its competitors in the dust. That must have just been a dream article to read when you saw it. Do you remember how you reacted to that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, one of the things from from the marketing standpoint, from my standpoint, is that the biotech companies were had a much greater ability to get favorable treatment from the media. Because they just seem to be more directed toward saving mankind. Or
human good.
Human good, yes. Where the electronic companies were always, we even see that more and more today, that there's something sinister about them. They're after profits. They're after their own control of the market. So those kind of stories, I think, were not unusual, except for the fact that they weren't in the science journal; they were in the business journals, and that was again where something that I think Genentech changed, and that I was able to do for them only because I would never have gone to the Journal of Medicine to publish that. Because I didn't know who they were. But the business press would help develop a startup and get it to that next level and get it the kind of financing that it needed, as well as the kind of partnerships that it needed. And that's why the business press became a significant vehicle for them, and probably why they got more favorable treatment.
Well, and apropos of that and what you were saying earlier about the cost of insulin, the second sentence, which is way down the article, it says, today somatostatin costs around $30,000 per gram to synthesize chemically, but Genentech believes it can bring the cost down to $300 or less. That makes it a business article, a social article, a human good article, as you were saying.
Yeah.
Which would get your attention.
Yeah. Now, this wasn't always true. I'll give you a comparison. There was a company across the bay called Cetus, C-E-T-U-S.
They're mentioned, too, in the article here.
And Cetus, after we sort of drifted away from Genentech because we really had nothing to do there. We were trying to do a newsletter for them, but we didn't have the kind of people that could actually support that. We did a couple newsletters for them, but I think they probably did most of the writing, because most pharmaceutical companies, the person who runs marketing is a is a scientist, is
a subject matter expert.
Yeah, they're really, really steeped in it. And I met those people at Lilly and at other pharmaceutical companies later on, but they generally pick somebody from the science world within their own management structure who, first of all, because of the regulatory issue, and because they can be, literally stumped on very quickly by the FDA if they go out of bounds. And the FCC, all kinds of people will jump on them if they're promising the public some solution that it isn't viable. And we saw this through Theranos, where the lack of getting a viable product to market, literally, and what they were saying, and versus the evidence, quickly got into the Wall Street Journal, and really that began the downward trend for them. So these are very sensitive areas that do require, I think, a high degree of specialization. And but Cetus again was at an early stage, and they were in a different. They, at least at the time, stated that they were in a different area, and that was largely what they called trying to evolve products out of biomass. And Pete Farley was the president, and unfortunately they kept talking about product time to market as being 10 years or 20 years. And I tried to convince them that just wasn't viable, that you couldn't go before the financial community, either the venture community or the financial community, and expect to raise money with that kind of life cycle. That you had to put a time to market, and they were basically a research operation, and they were trying to fund research. And but they had to have specifics, and they just never had, to my mind, enough specifics. And I did put a lot of presentations together for them for financial analyst meetings in New York, and went with them and so forth. But the subject would always go back to biomass, and it would wander off into theoretical stuff, and they just didn't seem to be able to focus on, like Genentech, that said, here is somatostatin, we're doing that now, and that is a precursor of us doing other molecules like the insulin. So that was very specific in people's mind. They could identify with a disease, they could identify with specific issues, but at Cetus you never could identify anything. And I think they're still around, but I don't know, and I haven't followed them, but I don't, for the longest time, you couldn't identify a specific market category in which they had made inroads. And so again, there really wasn't anything to do, and I had no problem because we had plenty of business of looking elsewhere.
I want to go back to one other aspect of Genentech, which you touched on, and I wanted you to talk a little bit more about it, which is Bob Swanson's relationship with Kleiner Perkins and with Tom Perkins. You said earlier that as you first started working with him, Bob asked you for help in patching that relationship up. What did you do? What did you have to do, and how did you do it?
I simply called Tom. I mean, the simplest thing, and said that I've been working with him, and that I think that you know, they want to raise money, and that you ought to have a conversation with Bob. I think there was feelings on both sides that this was a tension there when there really probably wasn't as much. I mean, Tom was a very practical person. He could be, you know, he could get pretty volatile and even angry on things, but you know, it passed quickly, and I think Tom knew that this could be a not only an interesting business, but a very viable business, I think, once he got the presentation. So I don't remember the specifics of what I said or did, or whether I showed him the original plan or something of that nature, but I do know that they got back in touch, and that Perkins pretty much, I think he picked up most of the tab for the initial fund deal. You know, I don't think there was they didn't spread the deal too much. I know that on that deal, I think Tom did everything, but I think they did a secondary, and Tom called me and said, "Hey, I'd like to get you in on the secondary." So I was involved in the secondary.
And then it went public not long after that.
Went public long after that.
Yeah. I want to close that bit now for a moment and talk about your notebooks, your note-taking, and your style of both recording events as they happen and then your own ideas. Because today in Silicon Valley, if you come to this part of the country, and it's not unique to this part of the country at all, but it's certainly part of the culture, everybody's got a notebook. Everybody's got one of these or something much smaller, and they carry it around. But you started that for yourself a long time ago, and it's an important part of, I think, who you are and how you worked and the history that you recorded. So let's talk about the Regis McKenna note phenomenon. How did you get started? What actually got you started carrying a notebook and using it the way that you came to use them?
I actually started when I first started college. I kept a notebook, and I wrote all sorts of things, and I did. I wrote a lot of poems. I wrote essays of what was going on. I was commenting on things around me, my thoughts, all of those kinds of. Some of them I think I threw a few of those notebooks away, as any of us would, you know, when you say, boy, was I dumb and naive and stupid in those days. But, you know, I wouldn't do it every day, but I'd do it periodically when I get some ideas or something. I would just scratch it down in the notebook. And then as I got out into the world, I started making comments on businesses, on people, on businesses that I saw, characters that were running them, those kinds of things. So I've got a lot of personal comments among just notes on the specifics of a business. It was my notebooks, which cover certainly my business career from 1970 to into the 2000s, and I still use notebooks. Were not intended as a record. They were not intended as you know, sort of a daily record of what is all going on. They were generally, sometimes some pages are just a few words here or there, which largely would give me sort of that night or that week to look at and say, oh, this is something I have to do, or this is something to fill in. So a lot of it people can't make sense of, because it was something that was done at that moment that referred to something specific I was doing. At other times, I literally would sit down and write long prose stories. So because I was on Apple's executive staff, and I always, Apple to me was a story. It was it happened at a time when they began. There was shortly thereafter Tom Peters and was it Townsend, his partner, who wrote the book In Search of Excellence, and it was really America was sort of particularly the industries and technology businesses were had their tail between their legs. You know, they weren't sort of wagging and boasting about how good they were and how great they were, because most of the industries that had come had vanished. You know, I was born and raised in Pittsburgh. That was the steel capital of the world, that largely supplied most of the steel for World War II and for all of the armaments and machines, and that whole Ohio Valley there, and moved to California, where it had on the verge of new businesses and new industries. And certainly the key one was the semiconductor business, but no one really knew where those products were going. They were going initially into military uses, and so what other businesses could be built on that? The people who had really seemed to take advantage was, say, Sony, who did the transistor radio. So there's not too many other things around here. We don't have a transistor television. We don't have a transistor. You know, we wouldn't put transistors in our car. So there was no sort of people taking advantage of it, and it seems as though those industries vanished because we weren't able to really fully take those products and technologies and leverage them into new industries. So Apple came along. It was at a time when the whole business community needed companies and examples. Here's basically two kids who were very young. At least one was a dropout. The name Apple itself was all American. When we did the original logo, it was the multicolors, which basically sort of was an affront to any the way the traditional was done. I remember looking at the time and looking at all the other logos. IBM looked like something that was built by Rome. You know, it was very the type was very solid and you know, it was like going to some old European castle towns or Roman ruins, and seeing the stability that had stayed there for years and years and years. So the idea of creating, just going outside the norm and doing something really different, that's what they appeared to be. And they had that attitude. You know, we are different. And having people who had a company who were, you know, younger than probably the children of, probably they were more the age of the grandchildren of the people that were running most of the large companies in America. And I even did this. I went around and asked people if they knew who the president of IBM was, who were the president of Texas Instruments. No one knew, but they even early on they knew who the president of Apple was. So there was this idea of doing something different, and that became a story to me, and it was a story that evolved. So I paid more attention to that, and maybe to Intel than others, though I do have pros notes. But and I even had things where I would comment. Here's one from my notebook. You can sort of see the my writing, not always that legible. And the title of this one I wrote was Power, Politics, and Ego. And
what's that dated?
See, that's the other thing. I didn't always date them. But this one came probably from the 80s.
So that's somewhere in that incredibly tumultuous period between when you met Jobs and Wozniak in '76 and Steve's departure and
yeah, I have really extensive notes on because I was on Apple's executive staff, and I have really extensive notes on that period of time. For example,
and what's that essay about?
It actually follows on before about Apple, and you know, the rest of the pages after that go into getting a call at home there was an emergency meeting, a staff meeting being called. I think it might have even been on a Saturday morning, and asked me to attend, and I went in, and I think that started the conversation in which the board was approached, I think, or John had gone to the board, and then
John Scully.
John Scully had gone to the board, yes, and there was some outcomes of that, and there was long discussions. But this went on for a couple weeks, that whole discussion. So this was really I put that, it was really, this is an article about John Scully and about his role, and
so this was what you wrote there is contemporaneous with that whole period.
Yeah, and all of the, like, for example, all of these notes are during that period, though there's a lot more, but there's quite a bit of. I mean, I felt like a journalist because I had met with Mike Markkula, I met with Al Eisenstadt, the attorney, several times, Ed Stead, who was also in the attorney's office. I met with Steve. I met with Markkula, other members of the board. I've talked to the secretaries. So I have some really long, extensive notes about that period that, in all honesty, I don't think anybody has told that story, and I'm not going to put it public. Because I think it would be too embarrassing to some people who were around, and I don't think I want to do that.
But you were doing this because it's just a way of you working out in your own mind what you were seeing and thinking. These weren't for publication. Maybe someday, because your notebooks are at Stanford now and accessible to researchers.
Not yet.
It'll someday.
There's going to be
there'll be a moratorium or an embargo.
Yeah.
But this was just your way, getting back to why you were doing all this, Apple and otherwise. It was a way of you just working out in your own mind what you were thinking.
Well, I had the habit of writing stories, when my wife and I moved to Philadelphia briefly before we moved to California, we went down to Washington, D.C. to a weekend with people who used to be her neighbors back in Pittsburgh. And they were a couple who had bought a place in Florida. And they had, his father was still alive there. And they were sort of interesting people. He worked for the government, and his opinions, and I would come back home, and then I wrote a short story on it. I went to Beirut in 1973, and I wrote a short story on that. Not fiction, but just what happened and what I observed and what I saw and so forth. So I would tend to, after having any kind of those experiences, just write something about it. And as I said, I started doing that a long time ago, and I was just interested, and I always thought maybe I would put those things into books, though I have files and files of unfinished stories on all kinds of subjects. And the Apple just became that, Intel became that. They became stories that I thought were really interesting, and I even thought of the title of the book would. I have two titles for a book. One is that I keep folded on. It's called Notes from Underground, that I would publish anonymously. The other one was If People Only Knew, and that is what goes on inside companies and boardrooms. But they don't. They never really see what really goes on. There's a lot of anguish, a lot of gnashing of teeth, and a lot of arguing and fighting and all kinds of things going on, and certainly good things too. But the way American corporations evolve is always through some sort of internal conflicts, that one management versus another, the people down at this level versus the people at this level, but I think I think we've evolved, particularly in later years, to something completely different, where the more I hear about a lot of the younger companies that have evolved here in Silicon Valley, there's so much more of a recognition of voices coming up, and participating in the overall management, and management policies that are much different in terms of bringing more people into the discussion and bringing more of the employees up. That I think is one of the really good things that I've seen happen here in Silicon Valley in the last 10 years or so. Because certainly a lot of the semiconductor companies still practiced what was going on they sort of initiated it, we're in this together, but I think there was still a lot of top-down. And certainly having worked for Philco for a brief period of time, I certainly saw that in spades there. It was all top-down. And I was literally told, by the marketing director at Philco, you will do what I tell you. When I tell you to do such and such, you do it, and you do it in this color and that shape and that high. And I mean, literally he said that to me, and my response, I remember my boss was in the room, and my response was such that my boss thought he was going to jump out the window. So, and I used to say, I'm not economically independent, I'm just independent.
As you reflect back on your notebooks now, because you spend a lot of time going back through and looking for things. And,
yeah.
What's your impression now of your thoughts over time and over the decades? Are you happy? Do you think you were when you were trying to faithfully record events, do you feel like you got it right? When you were just being creative and letting your mind run free, do you still feel that sense of freedom when you look through it? What's your overall take?
Well, first of all, no, I don't think I got everything right. I think being able to write down at the moment allows you to reflect on it.
Yeah.
And hopefully learn something from it, from even the observations that you were making. I think that. I think with regard to like Apple, I think that both Bill Campbell and I felt that Steve Jobs should have remained at Apple and been Chief Technology Officer. And I think that was a good decision at the time. Though Steve had other mind than we did. I tried to convince him of that, but it didn't work. But I think the multiplicity of experiences that I've had, I don't know too many people that have worked with as many different technologies or as many different companies. A lot that I didn't even record because they were just one-off sessions or speaking events at companies where I then got to meet the managements of top companies, and that included Xerox and Kodak and IBM and Digital Equipment and companies throughout Europe and Asia, Mitsubishi, Toyota, all of those companies. I mean, I've been with their top managements at times and learning a little bit about each one. Not all those experiences are in there. But the accumulation of experiences and the ability to sort of make comparisons and make judgments and then see outcomes through my life. When you ask how do we try to evolve as a business to be more of a consulting firm than let's say an advertising or a PR firm, what you realize is those are are certain functions that really don't have major impacts on the outcome of a business. They may in the consumer world where you're creating a consumer product, you do need to do that, but it's still not the key factor to your success. The key factors become so much more that you derive from seeing other instances and other companies not follow the technology, not pursue, not push the edges, not move to the next generation early enough, being late to market, not adapting, not having enough knowledge of their customers, particularly at the higher levels, being more top-down than bottom-up. All of those kind of things come together from just having been there and watched it and observed it, and you reflect on that in notebooks. I think those kinds of experiences, I feel that's one of the shortcomings of today's people going into marketing, or maybe even into any kind of the technology businesses, is generally the young engineers and the young people going into these businesses. And I've met a lot of them. I've for one reason or another, they contact me and want to have lunch, and I still have. I'll bet I have 5 or 6 of those requests a week, and we just have lunch and talk about things. And young people out of school, or parents who want me to talk to their kids going into industry here or so forth. And they're put in a cubicle, and they're focused in a very narrow segment. Where I had the experience of participating in management meetings at a very young age, and seeing everything that's going on in the company, and seeing the impact that when you come in and you check in at the counter into a new place, and then you actually then meet the chairman of the board and the board itself or the president. You see these two extremes, and we use their products, so we get it. And my son-in-law keeps saying, Regis, here's my checklist for when next time you see Tim Cook. So he tells me, and he's an engineer, so he tells me all these things, and we joke about it. But you get that kind of input that doesn't always get into the structure, or within the purview of the senior managements at companies, because as they get bigger, it's just harder to keep in touch with everything. There's just too much going on. I mean, when you look at Amazon and Apple now, trillion-dollar companies, they're trillion-dollar companies. It's an enormous amount to keep track of, and that's even hard for the smaller companies to really get. I know there's a lot of demands for for the senior people like Jeff Bezos and probably even now at this point Zuckerberg and certainly on Tim Cook. To the expectations of them, when in effect they're doing, their responsibilities are so broad and in so many different areas that putting priorities on things is difficult, and a lot of stuff gets pushed to the side because they just run out of time. And most of those people, I do know that Tim Cook is up at 4 in the morning and at Apple by 6 or 7, and after he does his workouts and so forth, and so his days are long. And if you're running a trillion-dollar company, that's probably expected.
It's funny, the other morning I finished a run at the Dish really early, one of those summer mornings when the sun's up at 5:30, and I ran down Stanford Ave to that little Starbucks at the corner of Stanford Ave and El Camino. Walked in, there were 3 people in that Starbucks, me and another guy and Tim Cook. Tim sitting there with his iPad, doing his email and drinking a coffee at 6:45.
Sure.
Probably the only quiet time he gets in an entire day.
Yeah, I mean, it's I get a lot of requests to ask him to do things, and if I talked to Tim about, if I just say, yeah, I went, I do go to almost all of the announcements, and then I send him back something about what I thought or whatever. And he's always responsive. But if I say somebody wants you to go here or give a talk or something, he never responds to that. I'm sure that's delegated to somebody, and he says, should I do that or shouldn't I? And I'm sure that right now, for example, or at least in the last couple of years, the issues of China and our own U.S. government, the trade tariffs that are being, that's all consuming, and yet he has a lot of other things to do. So the modern CEO of these large corporations, and we haven't seen those large corporations in the tech business ever. Remember, I mean,
that's right. It's only just now starting to happen.
I keep track of that because I keep the top companies, probably the top 50 companies in Silicon Valley, and there are more companies between over 5 billion in Silicon Valley. There are about 20, and 15 years ago there were half of that many, and 20 years ago there were about 6 or 7. So that's grown. The number of companies between a billion and 5 billion have almost tripled, and so there's the growth here has been enormous, and that's through recession years. So there are management issues here that I think have to be addressed. There are lessons that they don't have time to learn. They don't have time to sit down and go visit other companies and see how things are done. I've been, as far as I'm concerned, blessed because I've seen every technology. I've seen every kind of business, and on a global scale. And
you've seen every type of leader. You've seen every type of board member.
Right.
You've seen every type of entrepreneur. Getting back to your notebooks for a minute along those lines, what work have you done to distill some of the big lessons that are tucked away in all those many thousands of pages?
That's in my next life. There are things I think from that, but my notebooks, and I showed you this morning the sort of environmental charts that I did on the personal computer business, starting in probably the early '80s. Well, it would have been whenever the Apple first came out, so it would have been late '70s. And it was one of the models that I always used was that the world sees you and your product through prisms, and those prisms are economic, political, social, technological, competitive. There's a variety of factors, but your company is viewed through one of these prisms, and you're in the middle. And let's take financial analysts will look at you one way. A customer would look at you at another, and so they may look at you and define you in different ways. And understanding what's going on in that prism, for example, in the competitive nature, when you get into growth industries, new industries, each of those segments change almost monthly. I did that prism for the personal computer industry over a period of 10, 12 years. And I have each of those, and I put the different influencing factors, such as IBM entering the marketplace, or things like Java coming into the marketplace. All of these kinds of even technological changes that come in and have an influence on the personal computer business. People going out of business, recessions. All of those kinds of things happen over a period of a decade. And you can sort of distill that down into a 10-year-long case study of the personal computer rise.
Yeah. And that prism the analysis, and we'll include this in the oral history, could be done for any kind of technology, couldn't it? Because the first slide says the environment defines perception, and
right.
That's a principle that works across everything.
Right.
What do you hope researchers will be able to find and use from your notebooks and from your personal archive, Regis?
Well, it's a little bit like putting a new platform out there that people can decide what they want to do with it. I think that some of the stories that could be created out of the work that I've done will be new insight into a lot of things from the inside. That I mean, one of the examples I wrote, and this was my own commentary, and this was back in the 70s, that I wrote. I was at an Intel meeting, and I wrote that I guess I had just seen a report that Intel had said that something like 60% of their products were going into industrial products, another 20% into military, 10%, but all of them. But no one defined the emerging business. What did I call it? The emerging market for information and data in the consumer business, or in the computer business. And I said that that maybe they needed to do some research, because the whole world of data processing and information processing may be their biggest customer in the future. And that was just a commentary in the late 70s. And it was out of the fact that the markets that they were serving then were the old industries. And when Intel began, don't forget, they were a bipolar company selling sort of the same things other people were selling, but maybe a little bit better or newer technologies, but still going into machine tools and industrial products. Whereas the new products are going into more commercial, consumer types of products. That didn't happen until later on. But I think the companies that can start to do a little bit of projection and imagination, and I think imagination is really important, because a lot of what has come about, we think of science fiction, such as talking on your wrist phone, and those sorts of things. I do think that there are those kinds of things that you can, when you begin, either whether you're executive or anybody, of sort of keeping track of your career through notebooks and reflecting on where you've been, so you can see where you're going.
And do you think that's an important quality in a good CEO as well? You've mentioned a couple that were especially good. I mean, someone you respected a lot, I think, Bob Noyce, was credited with a couple of quotes that would seem to be contradictory. One was, don't worry about what's happened in the past, go off and do something wonderful. But another was to the effect that you have to understand what's happened before you can understand where you're going. And he seemed to be someone who could have a foot in both camps, and that was the way his mind worked.
Yeah, I mean, I think I told you about, I was in a meeting at San Jose State Engineering School where, there was a venture capitalist who told them if they really want to get themselves sort of ingrained in the industry and get funding from people in the industry, just focus on apps, because that's where the money is. And and my response was, if you don't understand sort of where the apps come from and how they're built and how they're the types of processors that are being developed today require new kinds of software, new kinds of apps. I mean, we've gone from processors that literally have 1,000 maybe transistors on a device, to something like this. And then, in fact, the next watch has a processor, and it's going to have 6 billion transistors in it. And that requires a look at everything around it, because that interfaces and the support necessary, the kinds of interfaces that you're doing, the speeds with which things change, the ability to put different kinds of applications and software on top of it. All those interactions come from looking at where it's evolving to. I mean, Moore's law built this valley, and that was always looking at the future. It wasn't looking at the past. But it was built on a past thing, and that proved that it was going to happen. And there are still people denying that that's happening, and yet, just in the last 5 years, we've gone from, a few million to 6 billion. And that's when and that's in the face of people saying Moore's law is dead. Now, I don't know when it will die, and there is a certain limit probably, but I know they're down at pretty small. They're down at the atom level now in terms of spacing for both the development of memory technologies as well as information technologies. So, if Moore's law doesn't sustain itself through the device level, it'll do it through the systems level. So I think it'll just move up to where the system is, is performing with a multiplicity of devices, and it will probably be pulling together networks of these devices together in which they create more. That's what essentially they're doing with sort of neural networks. It's not just a device, but it's connecting a lot of different devices together to act like synapses of the brain. And so, I think, but that's less important than saying when you're building a business that depends upon constant progress. And so there's sort of almost an enigma that goes on, and that is that the people want to not, and particularly I think in business, they want to stabilize on things. They don't want to change, and yet it is change that makes their business successful. It is change that brings new competitors up against them. It's change, so they've got to be constantly looking at what's changing in the environment, not what's staying stable.
And therefore, it's important if you're going to be a successful CEO.
You got to be out there.
The past as well as the future.
You got to be out there, and the successful ones are.
Yeah.
The successful ones are.
Just one final question about your notebooks and your note-taking. That's part of a much larger archive that you've accumulated during the course of your career. Just talk a little bit about the things that you felt it's important to keep. I was stunned the other day. We were talking about something in relation to one of the oral history sessions, and the next time we saw each other, you handed me an op-ed by Arthur Schlesinger from the Wall Street Journal from 30 years ago, which said, the future outwits us again, I think is the title of it, which
yes,
means
it is.
Success can only be viewed in the rearview mirror. It's only a fool tries to project all of that out into the future. You seem to have this incredibly diverse set of things that have meant a lot to you. I mean, you've kept these things because they're meaningful and they tie into something else. Talk a little bit about your archive beyond your notebooks.
And strangely enough, I can't often remember the name of somebody I met yesterday, but I can remember where I have something filed, from 40 years ago.
I think it's a common thing
is it? Yeah.
for us all.
Yeah, and if something's missing, you know that, right?
Yeah.
I think this just came from sort of this whole idea of constantly learning about not only the business you're in and the businesses that you're serving, the technology industries, but about the environment, because I think the environment plays, in the environment I mean that those total sphere of economic, political, social, and technological changes, to keep tabs on those, because they have more, and even Peter Drucker said it, your business will change more by outside influences than it will from anything you do internally. And that we certainly have seen, and we probably testify to that in terms of just all of the top companies in Silicon Valley being displaced by these whole new wave of network-based companies and software companies, whereas 20 years ago it was all hardware. That changed the way we all live in this valley, and so I keep files on, I hate to say this, but a lot of, almost everything, but I have file drawers that where I have clippings And so the clippings, I have things that go back to literally the 20s and 30s and 40s that I've gotten and filled in on things, the history of radio and television, those kinds of things, and even books on those subjects, because you learn a great deal about the past really teaching you about the future. In all of these industries, for example, there was a proliferation of radio stations everywhere, all over the world. There were a proliferation of companies in the radio business. There were a proliferation of companies in the TV business. And so it happens here, right? I mean, at one point I said there were 50 disk drive companies, or there were hundreds of PC manufacturers around the world at at the beginning. And so this was the same pattern that you would have seen over the last 100 years. So I have these file drawers in which I have stuff on economics, on the financial marketplace, on society, on the internet, on Amazon, on processor technology, on Moore's law. So if you look at even a photo of the headings of them, and then there's a whole big under to be filed yet, under specifics. But those were things that I went into my own research files for writing books and for looking at data and putting together presentations and things of that nature, so I could bring in stuff from the outside world. That for probably 10 years, I was a ferocious clipper on economic influences and trade influences, so I kept files on particularly diagrams that were published on competitive trade issues, or the movement of capital, or the movement of goods and services around the world, particularly related to technologies. And then I would publish those in, I would bring all those clippings in, probably 30 to 40 or 50 at a time, and have my people copy them onto just white paper. And so I would make little packets of these, maybe 25 to 50, and I would send them to the key CEOs on my list, so that they could just go through these and just see charts. And I had a name for them, and I forget what that was, but they created large books of this data that they didn't necessarily have to read a lot, but they could just go through and see 50 charts and graphs that have been published in Wall Street Journal and Business Week and Time and Fortune, and even the Times of London and Economist, those kinds of things. So probably didn't get copyright permission for them, but I was sending it to a small personal group of people. I wasn't, and I don't know if that excuses it, but I did it.
Well, you're probably doing the original publishers a favor by sending them out to all those opinion leaders.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. So that was a way of keeping the people up to date on sort of those environmental factors that are influencing change in their business.
Yeah. Well, and you have your mind just naturally works to assimilate and synthesize a lot of information coming in from a lot of places, and making it useful. Taking all that information and applying it in a way that has impact, whether it's for informing a CEO or developing a marketing strategy or a business strategy from that standpoint. So I can see how drawing that together and sending it out to your best clients would be helpful to them. I think you probably understood as well as any Fortune 500 CEO that there's so much information coming at you at any one time, unless somebody somewhere helps to assimilate at least a little bit of it and put it in a form you can use, you're not getting ahead of the game.
Yeah, there was one president, CEO of a company who I was talking about. I don't remember what the book was, but I had read it, and I said, it's a book you ought to read. I was telling him this, and he said, "Did you read it?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Did you highlight it?" And I said, yes. He says, can I borrow it?
Send me the highlighted version.
Yeah. So that's this overwhelming nature of being a leader of a company. And now we know that in this age of the products and technologies are so impacting our social lives today that I had this discussion today about say Facebook, where they didn't come to the realization that they weren't just making a product. They were making something that had huge impact on society, as if they were a public utility or a public service or a government. It had far-reaching impact than I think they themselves realized. And so it requires, although he's passed away, my sort of mentor in college was a professor named Bernard Boland, and he had degrees in philosophy and in physics, and he had a multiplicity of degrees. He sort of came out from Holland when he and his wife escaped from the German influence there, the German invasion into Holland, and came to the United States. But he was just a marvelous teacher had all of this sort of knowledge of wide range of subjects. And I stayed in touch with him. He was at DePaul University in Chicago when we last talked, and he had passed away. But he was being called on by, he told me, many companies, large companies, to come in and talk about, the philosophical issues within organizations and companies. And that I think is that you need a CEO who has the ability, not necessarily to know those subjects, but to at least be able to bring in people who could help have. I know that Intel had hired anthropologists, and they had hired even I think psychologists and so forth. And I think those kind of people that come in with the liberal arts. I mean, I'm a big believer that liberal arts is an asset, because I was at once sort of the lone liberal arts person in Silicon Valley and technology businesses. There were others, but I think, and I was told, when I was at Philco, they did a personality test on me, or some sort of a test to see if I fit in the company, and I was told that I really ought to find a job in another business, another industry, and that was in 1965, and this was the standard test that they gave all employees to see where you fit. And so they said you're orthogonal to the engineering mind, and this is what this company's all about. So you have to find a job somewhere where you can, teach or do something else. And I did find a lifelong job in teaching, but it was not what they expected. But I think we need that sort of influence. Steve Jobs again said that they felt that the arts and the sciences, and engineering really is what has continual intersects to be part of Apple, and I think it is proven that it can create at the right time and the right place and the right people can create this marketing is everything, because it puts it all together and it appeals to the world. And so I think that we need more of that today in our executives, so that they can start, because I think more and more the corporations are shaping our society more than our governments are. We can see that right now. The influence of success within companies over the last 10 years, 10, 15 years, through even recessionary times, continue to be strong. The market continues to be strong because, in a way, I think they're ignoring the government. And this is where I sort of become more conservative in saying it is the government that's getting in the way. We're missing the benefits of the government continuing to invest in science and continue to support the science world. But I think that the roadblocks are coming now to which they're inhibiting the growth of science through their negative views on just the environment itself could be a huge opportunity for the development of sciences. The security, I did work with some people. One of the last big jobs that I was doing was working on with some people out of Lockheed on, I felt that you could go into an airport and never have to go through a screening mechanism because there was so much data out there that you could actually, on any one person, you could pull all that data together in less than a second. And I put together a list of all of the public databases that we all are exposed to, you know, from birth records to divorces to marriages to taxes to all those records are there. A lot of data on all of us, and it's all sitting in databases somewhere that can now all be synthesized when, you know, and be protected. I mean, I'm not saying it's not protected, but there are ways around, you know, there are ways to actually implement security systems that require huge investment in software and in new kinds of software and maybe neural networks and artificial intelligence and scanning and, you know, and all of those kind of things. But it could all be synthesized, and I felt it would be sort of like the space project, and that's what I compared it to, was the space project put around the security of a nation, largely driven by software, secure software. If the investment were made in it, I think we could do that. And so we could be driving it, but the government's not doing that. It's being done on the private side. It has to be done.
We're going to begin the afternoon session now, and we've talked both chronologically and thematically. I think for anyone who's reading through or watching the interview, Regis, it'll be very clear that we're kind of skipping back and forth between theme and chronology, and that's good, because whoever is reviewing this over time will have the benefit of being able to skip back and forth and tie it all together, but I think it makes sense to us. We're going to go back to chronology now, because in our earlier sessions, in various ways, we've covered the period up to about the mid-1980s from your business standpoint, when things were incredibly strong. And I'm going to talk about the period from 1986 to about 1990 now, briefly. By that time, by the mid-80s, I've gone through the client list, which will also be part of the oral history record, and you've had more than probably 250 clients up to that point at various stages, major, small, some long-term, some more project-oriented. Yeah. And then in 1986, you decided to make an alliance. It's ironic we're talking about alliances now, because we were 5 minutes ago offline we were talking about alliances in another context. You decided to make an alliance with Pete Marwick, align your business with their business, and I'd like to take a few minutes just to explain the context. First of all, explore the context in which that was happening, why I'm sure you had many potential partners you evaluated, and why they seemed like the best partner, and what you hope to achieve. So let's begin at the beginning. Maybe you could say, in the mid-80s, here's where your company was as a business and why an alliance seemed to make sense.
Okay. We were doing a multiple things in the sort of what was called marketing services, including the advertising and the PR, which I think we always tried to take to a different level or a different depth in companies than that was done. And some we succeeded, and some we didn't. But the value added of having people in a company that were, and I think most people, actually even people in our company would say, we had a lot of really, really bright people in our company, and kept moving up the stream that way, trying to bring in better and better, more talented, more experienced people. That you got to a point where there was enough people with MBAs in our company and enough people who were thinking about doing more than simply implementation of the strategies. That I thought we ought to continue to move in that direction. The one problem was, of course, earlier on was doing that was survival, because, as I mentioned, this was sort of an anti-consultant world, and so the advertising and the PR and were really sort of things that you earn money from, but it allowed us to have a platform to also explore, learn, give our ideas, and participate in the company's strategy, businesses, or processes. By 1985, I had sold the advertising business in 1981, and I had to basically start over. I think we had a couple $1 million worth of business that was not advertising. But that was a fairly lucrative business, and so we had to really rebuild. So by 1985, 86, we were back up over 10 million, and that enabled us to spread our wings a little. And being impatient to go further, I had some discussions with some consulting firms about doing the processes that we did, and some of the what we called products, where we did internal and external audits, and where we developed a strategy for taking new technologies to market. And a lot of these were really formalized programs in which there was a process that we had developed. And I had talked to, quite frankly, I talked to partners at McKinsey in New York. And we had conversations. They wanted to work alongside us for a year before deciding whether or not they would want to either merge or acquire us, which I said, no way.
No way.
We talked to Hill and Knowlton. I had meetings with their top-level people. The same sort of thing happened in that they wanted to, as the fellow said, most of our people, place brochures on chairs in halls where the company's going to have some kind of an event. There's not a lot of strategic, in-depth thinking done in those companies. They're implementers, and I'm sure these companies have changed since that time. But so I had discussions with a number of companies, including Gemini, which was a fairly well-known global consulting firm. But Pete Marwick was a large accounting firm, was trying to get into other businesses, and they had spent some money acquiring a consulting firm back in Boston. I don't remember the name right now, but they were an IT consulting firm, and really very much in sync with the way we did things, and we made a good partnership, and because more and more of our clients were in the computing field, and they were people out of MIT and Harvard and had some really top-notch consultants, and we got to be close to those people, and Pete Marwick had acquired an interest in them, maybe even most of the company. They had also a smaller company out here that was doing consulting in processing and manufacturing, particularly in semiconductors and other processes here in the area. They acquired pieces of that. I don't think they acquired the whole thing, but they acquired it, and they had the ability, they had the distribution, the ability to have their partners learn about the business and then sell it to their clients across the world. So we could have hopefully grown through that mechanism.
And just to put this in context, first from the standpoint of these, what were big accounting firms at the time? Accounting was their core business,
Absolutely.
but they weren't KPMG, Pete Marwick. They weren't the only ones. Arthur Anderson was trying to do this.
And Anderson was successful.
Yes.
And then they split their business, yes.
They were trying to become full service.
That became the model.
Business partners for their core accounting clients.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And KP wanted to do that. And we got to know particularly the technology partner who was in Minneapolis, and he came out, spent a lot of time, kept coming back and forth. We met a lot with him. His name was Tom Moser, and I remember the name because I knew 3 Tom Mosers in the business, in the industry at the time. But Tom was a very strong technology partner at Pete in trying to get them into technology companies and businesses. So we did. They didn't acquire a major interest in us. They acquired something like 40 to 50%, 40 to 49%. And even with that, they gave us the money in order for us to expand. But simultaneously, and perhaps one of my biggest downfall was John Doerr asked me if I would become a partner at Kleiner Perkins, not full time, but half time, which meant that although I would attend all the partner meetings, I would work half my time at. I used to say I used to work half my time at. What did I say? 100% of my time at Kleiner and 100% of my time at my company. And so it was like sort of the producers. I sold 150% of myself.
What was before we talk about that offer from John Doerr? Talk a little bit about your involvement with Kleiner and its companies overall. This morning we talked about Genentech and
Tandem
and that, but there were others, and a lot of them were Tom Perkins led investments too,
right,
weren't they?
Yeah, and again, I'm not 100% sure. I do know that I met Tom Perkins as one of the first people out here in the Valley when I was in the publishing business, and called on his little company, and I remembered calling on him, and I know that after when he formed Kleiner and Perkins. I had lunch with him up on Sand Hill Road, and we talked about what I was doing, and I knew what he was doing because friends of mine like Don Valentine had gone into that business. I knew most of the venture capital people around in the area simply because many of the small companies, were backed by venture companies, and I would either come across the company and then refer it to somebody or suggest that they go to somebody, or they would, through that venture, like Genentech, got to know me because of other companies that I had as clients at Kleiner. So it really was the Silicon Valley network that was at work, that was helping to, once you sort of get into that network, it becomes a sort of referral system, and that's how I benefited from it. And John and I had worked at Intel, on the single board computer, and trying to get Intel into the personal computer business back in the hobby club era. And we put together packaged components and sold them through Byte Shop and through other kinds of hobby stores on building your own computer. And that we promoted and marketed a year before Apple was even founded. So John and I stayed in touch, good touch, and Brooke Byers, who was also a partner there. Brooke started out of college working for Sullivan Reading Centers, which was a Stanford professor who had started this remedial reading for children after school, and he had these remedial centers all over California and other places. And Brooke hired us to help him because he went into marketing right out of Stanford Business School. And so I was working with Brooke before he joined Kleiner. Jim Lally was also another person who turned Kleiner, and Jim was at Intel. So a lot of these people, we had worked together on, product marketing issues and on bringing products to market. And what more do you need as somebody that knows sort of how to go about bringing companies and products to market? I mean, basically a startup is bringing a product to market of some kind. And so that was the origin, I think, for John's interest in having me join. And it was a good experience. I think it just became sort of overwhelming in terms of time consumption and so forth after about 5 or 6 years, plus the Kleiner or the Pete Marwick thing was not working. So those things were sort of go hand in hand. I was paying more attention, I think, to startups and going on boards. I was on 6 or 7, maybe 8 boards, and continuing to go to the partner meetings, and then also trying to sort of run my company. And it turns out that Pete had added a lot of expense to the company. They added people on our side of the business. They really didn't understand the technology business or understand technology marketing, and every project turned into an effort to get their audit. And
so that was it was a business development strategy for them as
from
much
the
as it
from
was
the people who were on the ground working. It was
yes.
But from when they did get a project, they would. I remember 1 or 2 projects in which they brought us in at the 9th hour when it was due for us to do the project, and they would present it, and so they would then say, hey, we get 90% of that billing, and so we were not getting the billing. They would push all the billing towards them. There was all these little issues, and so that continued to sort of deteriorate from '86 when by '87 we did the deal in '86, '85 maybe, but around that time frame, '85, '86, and I joined Kleiner in '86, and Kleiner was just overwhelming, and I really wasn't paying much attention to what was going on at RMI. By the time it came about, we looked like we were on the brink of going out of business. They had built huge backlog of receivables. They had hired over 20 people, were making over $100,000 a year, but producing no income. This again is big accounting firm thinking. We get a lot of people to do things, but they don't necessarily. They make a lot of money, but they don't necessarily do anything.
Well, that was so contrary to where you had always done things, right? You built your business after you got the contract, after you had the
right.
income.
We always paid as we go.
Yes.
And we didn't hire people till we had the money. And I used to digress that I use the example a lot of times at work about I dated a young woman in high school whose mother owned a candy store, of all things, and it was right near the school, and it was a little penny candy type of thing, and her husband had died when she was very young, the girl, and her mother was but she kept this together, the family, by doing that candy store. And I remember talking to her about how she manages it, and she said, I have 2 drawers. I have input and output. She said, and when I sell enough candy, then I can buy some. I put it over here, and I can buy with this money. And this is for, so he kept the business that way. And I said, that's us. You fill up the 1 drawer, and then you can go out and buy more candy. But so it was a candy store was the business model, and the candy store was not able to buy more candy, and so I decided I went back in about '89, they had 2 people running, one guy from Pete Marwick and one person from our side that were sort of co-managing the place. I know I fired 21 people within the first week, And I got a good CFO who came in on, first of all, on a temp kind of basis. We turned the receivables around and really grew our business, got the business back on profitability, certainly within a year. And then just basically grew back from there again. And I had to think differently about, alliances and all those sorts of things. And I had a lot of offers from companies to be acquired, both when I was an ad agency and whenever we were the marketing firm. But in all cases, those were buyouts, and you earned earnouts rather. They would give you initial payment, and then you would stay with the company for 5 years, and you would buy yourself over those 5 years, which is the way I put it. And I said, no, I won't do that. With Jay Chiat, when I sold the advertising, I said, I'm not going to buy myself. So you're going to pay me cash on a potential earnings type of thing, and when you transfer the business, I don't ever hear from you again. I did tell him that. No, I did. We stayed friends, and we even co-invested in some tech companies and that sort of thing. But
as far as consulting back on the business,
I said I don't want to save the
him.
business. I don't want to come in and go back in and be your account person at Intel and Apple and all of those kind of places. They continued to be clients for us, and actually good clients for us, because the sort of work that we were doing was well beyond the advertising area. The other issue that occurs is trying to recruit really top-notch creative people to this area, art directors who have done film, and people who know how to buy national media, international media. All of those kinds of things are not in this area. I used to say this is not the mecca of advertising. It's Los Angeles, New York, Chicago maybe, and London. Those are the places. And that's why Chi-Date started out in Orange County, moved to LA, became Chi-Date. It was Chiat, then it became Chi-Date, and then he moved and opened an office in New York. And that's how he grew into a large by recognizing that. And I certainly didn't want to do that. I wanted to stay here. And so it really was, I knew the writing was on the wall and that we had to get out of the advertising business simply because we couldn't bring in the kinds of talent. We tried, but they would not stay more than 6 months or a year, largely because there were no other companies around here that were doing the kind of volume advertising that Intel and Apple was doing. And so sooner or later, we needed more professional help there. And so that's the reason why I got out of that business. From then on, it was really a question of either growing our own or selling the company. And I felt selling the company, at least from my standpoint, was again buying myself. And it turns out that sort of a boutique consulting firm with your name on the door is a formula for problems. And certainly it was, because you're one-arm paper hanger, and it's you're doing a lot of things. My wife was always saying that every time we'd take a week off, sure enough, the phone would be ringing all the time I was gone. And so it seemed all the disasters happened whenever you try to take a few days off.
Yeah, at least they get magnified,
yeah,
don't they?
And so, and really, I think that so I bought the company back from Pete Marwick. There was a fellow named John Madonna. John became the youngest CEO at Pete Marwick. There was sort of a coup at Pete Marwick back in 88, 89, and it was all the young crowd there was a lot of old-time management there, and it was in place, and it was, we're going to manage and we're going to select who our successors are, and you had to put someone in much tenure and all those kind of things. And there was, I think they may even call them the Young Turks, that the young partners who were called partners but weren't receiving the compensation that the other partners were receiving, and so they basically had a vote, though. So they basically, voted, and John became one of the youngest guys to go in as the top guy at Pete Marwick. John and I met, and he came down, and I remember he sat in my office, and I said to him, John, this is not working. And he said, yeah, and he said, and you were the most successful of the deals we did. So I guess the one in Boston completely they wiped out. I mean, it just destroyed the company. The one out here kept enough control to where it didn't happen. The sort of consulting firm that, and I don't recall the name right now, but I think they may even still be around. We're helping manufacturers and improving processes and those kind of things. But the other deals that they had done, and they had done a number of them, they just didn't succeed at. And so we made an agreement. Obviously, they were willing to almost give it to me, but so I bought it back for next to nothing.
So he agreed that it wasn't working and it needed to be unwound.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so Valentine suggested that I had the perfect business, whereas you grow a business, you sell it, and then you buy it back for nothing.
And use that as a base to keep growing.
Right.
But that's painful. That's not an easy process.
My wife said I aged 10 years during that period of time. It was you were literally working 24 hours a day.
Well, and your business wasn't slowing down. I mean, the partnership may not have been working, but it was in the context of a business that in many ways was going strong. The RMI at the time was receiving a tremendous amount of public attention.
Yeah.
It just in the industry, it was
right.
You had built a reputation as the company to go to for the types of expertise that you had.
And I have to credit a lot of the people that work for me with that as well. I mean, long-term people that were there 20, 25 years, although people didn't know them very well. I mean, as I said, Gil Holste, who was sort of a jack of all trades. There was, a number of people along that line, that were there a long, long time. The CFO that we had, Dan Sicani, has his own CFO firm now. Where he does financial managements for startups and that sort of thing, and has been very successful. Elizabeth Cheney was also one of the people there about 25 years. I think she developed more of almost the conceptual thinking and so forth that was very powerful. She hired a lot of really key people, and there were others. I mean, we probably had a core of really strong people there, and then into the 90s and up into 2000. We brought in a lot of young MBAs out of Wharton and Berkeley Business School, and we tried a few Harvard people, but they generally just wanted a ticket to the West Coast. And Stanford had all of them had other opportunities, although we would go out and make presentations at the business schools, and those young people really were excellent at doing work. I mean, they just were superb. 3 or 4 of them have created, companies here in the Valley. Left. They had strong technology backgrounds. I think it's what is it, Fitness Pal or that company?
MyFitnessPal.
Yeah, that's one of the people that founded that was a partner, or was a consultant with us. And there's a fellow Vijay Baba, who was an Indian consultant and then partner. Vijay went back to India and created a very, very successful business, and I think he sold that for a lot of money and is starting other businesses. So I mean, there's quite a few of the partners that we have who've gone off and been very successful in business, and so on their own they were very, very well. But it's a lot of times. And I learned this from Tom Peters, actually, that, the way I had brought him in to talk to us all about how McKinsey a lot of bright people, how they really ran the company. And he ended up saying, I really don't know. It's like managing cats, right, or herding cats. A lot of very bright people, but the compensation was good enough to have everybody stay there. And then they had the way of having a lot of ex-people who were really loyal, and then would come back and hire them. So and that took 30, 40, 50 years to do, and it's still sustaining and putting out people that go out into industry and then hire back into McKinsey. I think my criticism is that they're a little more formulaic than industry should be very, very flexible and be constantly changing, and that the formulas should be changing. The algorithms have to change every 6 months, and most consulting firms are not capable of doing that. But in any event, so getting out of that and getting back into the mainstream, but all in all, and I shut down a number of offices that Pete Marwick had started. We had, I think, something like almost 8 or 10 offices around the world. They were putting them where their key partners were, but not necessarily where the technology businesses were. So their objectives and our objectives ended up being completely different, and I wasn't smart enough to see that in advance. But I think thereafter, I ended up traveling, 200, 250,000 miles a year, and it was it just got to be. I got a lot of writing done on planes.
Because there's a lot of plane time involved.
And you're having new experiences, and then writing. I'd pull out my notebooks and write long things on planes, and I did almost all of my books. I did 5 books I did on planes. So you get time to do that and meet other people and do other things. But it's one of these things where I felt that I could be more successful on my own, doing startups and working with those startups and helping them and investing in them. And I was able to do that by that time, by the year 2000. And so I talked to the partners about that, and I literally divided up the stock among all of them and said, it's yours, which they all went their separate ways and created their own little companies, and I thought that was a perfect ending, quite frankly, because I didn't have to lay off a lot of people or do that sort of thing.
Now you've just ended the company, and I'm not ready to end the company yet. So we'll call that a preview of what happens down the road. I want to go back though for a minute. That's the RMI side of it, and the KPMG Alliance side in that 5 years or so from '85 to 1990. Let's talk about the Kleiner side of it. It was. It makes perfect sense that you would be asked to come into Kleiner, but did it also strike you as a somewhat unconventional invitation? You knew everyone or all the key people within the partnership. You'd already become friends with them. You'd seen them invest. You'd helped their companies, Genentech being among the many notable ones, Tandem's another one. There were many that had benefited from working with you.
John even had me come in and talk to the Segway people when they were in trouble. Yeah.
So was it? I don't know how to put this other than, was it fun? Was it enjoyable? Did you see some things that you really enjoyed doing during that period with Kleiner?
I think it was it was quite difficult at first, kind of working in. It was pretty much done on a consensus basis, and Tom Perkins was still there, so it was pretty much the full partner. Kleiner, Perkins, Caulfield, and Byers were all there. It was a process that they went through, and how you bring in new deals. It generally was that you just didn't present that deal at the table. You generally talked to people around the office. Before that, I think it was more difficult that I was doing it half-time because I wasn't there every day.
And that really made a difference?
It made a big difference. It made a big difference, I think. I think when you're there, you just spend more time with your partners, and you work jointly on various deals. Now, I was doing that, but certainly not on a day-to-day basis. There were a number of companies in which Jim Lally and John Doerr and I were involved. Silicon Compilers was one that John had started, but the founder was from Intel. I knew him. John knew him. John asked me to come in and be on the board. That was a very early venture into automating the chip design process with, by compiling the code for design. But it struggled. In those days, the semiconductor industry wanted to do everything themselves. It was hard to sell to them. Tandem was a little bit easier because it was already a hardware company, and I was still helping them. Genentech was one in which it was really just getting them off the ground and helping to establish them. And I think there was the major deal there was getting them together with Eli Lilly, and I'm trying to think of some others, but I probably worked on, I don't know, many of their companies, and they continued to do that even after that partnership was a 10-year deal. And after that 10 years, I still, invested in Kleiner deals. I was, I was a limited partner, a special limited partner, up until probably a few years ago. And so I was able to take companies that I saw to Kleiner and have them look at them. And same with Sequoia. And in fact, one of the things that happened right after I sort of decided no longer to be with Kleiner is Don Valentine approached me and asked me if I would be. He wanted to do a reunion board for two companies. One was down in Texas, and one was called Microchip up in Arizona. Where was it? It was outside of Phoenix. But there's a silicon sandy beach there or something they call it. And Microchip was building microcontrollers, which I knew something about because of Intel had a microcontroller that was sort of a fixed microprocessor for fixed applications, although it's still programmable. And the Texas company was a super mini computer. So both of those, Pierre Lamond and I and Don, were all on the boards, and initially, and were early investors. So even though I wasn't a partner, it taught me a lesson, and it was actually one that I told Bill Campbell, and that was, don't go to work for any one venture. They all wanted him, when he was deciding to go out, I said, don't go to work for any one venture firm. There's a lot of venture firms that would like to have you be consultant to them, because Kleiner wanted him to be a partner, and they had offered it to him, and he then turned it down. But he worked with half a dozen venture firms in the area who brought him in and got him as an advisor to many of their companies, and it not only made him very successful financially, it also got him a network of his that people now continue to say he was one of the models of having somebody come in who's an outsider, who is talented and can help. He was in. John Doerr brought him into Amazon to advise Bezos when he was struggling. So Bill was really a sort of a saint figure to a lot of companies out here. And that process, that consulting arm, was a good model for me too, and that's what I continued to do.
What did you had been, by that time, you'd been around a lot of young companies that you'd seen succeed, going all the way back to National, and then to Intel, and then to Apple, and then to Genentech, and I mean, the list goes on. in that period when you got to observe the whole process of entrepreneurship from the perspective of the venture side, what additional learning did you get about what makes an entrepreneur successful? Not just the company, but the quality of the person that you see who makes it go or perhaps struggles to make it go.
Yeah, I think in both cases, whether or not the person really has the foresight to say, here's where this business is going to take me and us. The one real lesson that I learned was it's more important who invests in you than how much. Because those are the people, the early investors, the early venture people become your board and become your advisors. And they are the people who link you to the talent out there that could really help you when you need something. And by and large, at the time, a lot of the people in the venture business were ex-operating people. And so they have, and still there's an awful lot of those people out there. And so to get a lot of young people into the venture business who are just fresh out of school, they don't know who to pick up the phone and call and say, hey, I want you to see this person. But if you're in a very successful company, or at least a growth company or a company, generally when you go to board meetings in one of those companies, a lot of the conversation is, I know so-and-so at this company and I can introduce you to so-and-so. Let me get so-and-so a meeting between you and them, and you can sort of move your business in that direction, or you can partner with this company. They're always advising on what their network should be like. And the network builds the company. You know, it's, an island doesn't create a village. What is it? One man doesn't create a village. You need a network of people to create a company. And we love to idolize the one-man entrepreneur who comes in and does everything. So, I mean, I think, Steve Jobs is accredited with certainly far more than he himself probably would tell you that he did. It was really other great people that were there around him, and people outside who gave him advice. And I think when he came in and formed the second board, he got people who were networked and could help bring in other types of talent and other types of. They had his interest at heart. And it wasn't like they were exclusively going to listen to Steve, because most of them argued with him. But by that time, he was willing to argue back and to be convinced. And I think the initial people just didn't have that kind of reach into the tentacles into the businesses. And Steve had no control over it himself anyway. So he was able to select the kinds of people that he thought he needed to build a network. I think that's kind of rule number one. I think remember when John F. Kennedy went to see Eleanor Roosevelt to be sort of interviewed to become president, and this was when he was running, and she was telling him all the things that he doesn't probably know yet because he's too young. And John Kennedy replied, "It's too bad there isn't a college course in how to be a president." And that's pretty much the way it is here. If the CEO, the founders, or the founder, doesn't have enough scope of knowledge, not only about his business but about the things that are necessary longer term. So one of the questions I like to ask venture is, so what's your second product? And a lot of times that stumbles people. They really don't know. They've got one idea, and where does that idea go? What's that idea look like 5 years from now or 10 years? You don't really know where it's going to be, but you have to have some vision as to where you think it's going to be and how that's going to grow, or you're not going to become a business. You're going to become a one-product company. And it's hard to do that today. You have to have multiple services off of that business. So I And again, I'll go back to Steve, and I hate to keep quoting him, but in fact, in a conversation that we had, which I recently read in my notebooks, he called me on a weekend, and we were talking on one of our calls, and it was sort of during the dot-com boom, and he said, I guess people think there's no end to this, that they really don't have to build anything. They just have to sort of take the money in, and it happens on its own. He said, but you really have to build a strong team. It's the people who make things. It's the teams that you build. He was emphasizing the quality of the teams and he did that. I mean, he always had a very strong team around him. And maybe it would have been isolated, in some instances isolated from the rest of the company, but that was the team that was always really loyal to him and willing to go to the ends of the earth to make things happen. And I think you need that kind of reach, that kind of team effort in early venture firms. But the most negative things I've seen in startups were the board, who try to build a strategy, constantly question and create new strategies. It's kind of strategy of the month, direction of the month. When they start seeing things aren't going well, they're not willing to stick with it. I mean, and I can even remember going to the backers of one company that I was involved with, that they had gotten to a period that was this was coming into sort of one of the down periods in the industry, and this company had built a strong technical team. The products, it was in the enterprise space, and they were having difficulty, getting into the enterprise versus some of the major players that were there. And most of us felt that it just took, maybe even another year of funding or another 2 years of funding. But investors get impatient. They're not willing to essentially stay in there with the money, and they said they wanted to get out of the business. And I said to one venture guy, I said, you've put $5 million into this company, and you're just going to walk away from it, and then you're going to go out and start another company, and you're going to spend $10 million to get the same kind of team that you got right here. And but that's not the sort of logic that they do. I mean, they're trying to get quick hits, and some of the venture companies used to call it the cookie cutter business. Get something that you keep, stamp out, make a lot of them, and get it out there fast. So the world has changed dramatically, and sometimes you hit on those kinds of things, and it's sufficient to, the Google public offering made a lot of money, billionaires, not millionaires, billionaires, and that was one hit that some people had once in a lifetime. They didn't have it twice in a lifetime. So the majority of companies in Silicon Valley are in that 1 to 5 billion. They're not in the 5 to a trillion.
That board phenomenon you were talking about a second ago, about the wrong kind of contribution that a board can make to a startup. How do boards like that get built in your experience? And maybe in answering that, you could talk about, from your perspective, how does a good board get built? One that really does do those things that you talked about that are the right things.
I think that, again, it's very individualistic, but I think that the wrong boards get built because the company feels they have no alternative. They're turned down by the major ventures, the top-notch ventures, and so they seek money wherever they can get it. As a result, they bring people on the board who will put some amount of money in, but don't necessarily have any contact or any long-term interest in sustaining that industry or that business. They're very short-term notice, and I actually just watched a company disintegrate over that. In fact, I've watched 2 in the last that I can think of, in which the board basically, no, I can think of 3 now. I could probably go up. Yeah, I can go up, and it is where the board is forced into, or people come onto the board because of other, you can't raise the money, so you go where you can get money, and so as you reach further down into the barrel, you get down in there to the sentiment. It's not very lively and not very interactive, I don't think there's much outreach. I was giving a talk somewhere. This was again about 10 years ago, but I was talking about this whole aspect of how building a board. It was some kind of an entrepreneurial conference or something, and I said, you really need to get a board. This is this idea that it's more important who invests than how much. And afterwards, some young man came up to me and said, told me a little bit about his business, and he said, we need introductions to this industry and this industry or this company or whatever. And I said, well, why don't you get your board, your investors to do that? And they said, they don't do that. They just give us money, but they don't do that. And I said, give the money back. And I know, for example, Bill Campbell has recommended that to people, give the money back, because you're not going to really succeed with that kind of a board. And I've seen it happen. And as we're talking, I'm thinking of 4, 5, 6, 7, where the board and the people who have given the most money, not the most intellectual input, are listened to more. And one of the things when I give my talks on Silicon Valley, I talk about the fact that the reinvestment of money is one thing, but people make money and then they go out and put it into funds, and then that funds go back in, or people privately put money into these startup companies. But more important than that is the reinvestment of intellectual property, intellectual knowledge, and advice. And the best people that I've seen do that on boards are people who have just simply been around a while. I'm on the board. I'll use this particular individual because I think most people do admire him, but I've been on the board with John Young with a company for a long time. And I mean, can you imagine having, former president of HP and a very highly respected man, good thinker, and regardless of what people thought about him at HP, he has certainly had a broad range of experience in industry, and the advice he can give, the kinds of analysis he can give, the kinds of, he'd run big companies. He knew different aspects of things. And I've seen that from people who've had that kind of experience as having run companies, have running businesses, have had, and how they form their board is by getting people on your board who have various expertise in various areas that you think you're going to need. I think entrepreneurs are not given enough advice on that sort of thing. So if you have to hold off on taking money from people, don't just take it because you have to survive. And it's better, I think later on you'll wish you hadn't done it.
Well, and your first piece of advice I think is so telling, which is it's in the beginning, it's more important who you take your money from than it is how much money you actually raise. And I would think that would be a confusing message to many entrepreneurs who would think, no, I've got to have the money to get my company off the ground. And what you're saying is actually do it the right way from the start and the money will tend to follow. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. It's not that the company isn't going to make mistakes or whatever. Again, a practical example is a company called Nanosys, and I'm on the board of that now. I think it's going on 15 years. And it's a materials-based company. They build the quantum dots that Samsung uses in all their color TVs and that sort of thing. So they sell it to display companies that want to get higher quality color and really differentiated color out of their displays. And that was because nanotechnology and quantum dots were supposed to solve every problem in the world, but it took almost 8-10 years to focus it down on just displays, because before that they were a little bit of everything and really were unable to build any kind of steam. But they've had pretty much the same board and very good quality investors, very good board, who eventually brought in the right management and were able to focus it down. But they raised, I think, something like 70 to 80 million when they were getting started. And they got good quality investors who stayed with their investments over time and who were willing to make advice and see the company change and shift. I mean, I used to say it was never my job or my company's job to predict the success or failure of a company. Our job was to try to be like the rocket ship that's going to the moon. You help shape it, you help change it, you help move it in a different direction, you help. So if it's a good valuable technology to begin with, and a good valuable product to begin with, then you can begin reshaping it. So the technology creates, but market refines. The marketing refines it, because marketing is the feedback loop. And defined as a feedback loop, you then change it. So software changes constantly because you're always getting updates, and that's a feedback loop that they monitor everything they get back from the marketplace, and they're saying, here are where the issues are, here is where the changes we need to make. So the next revision is always a change. So they're constantly adapting to the marketplace. It's kind of the perfect business. And that's the way all businesses should be.
That's a perfect segue into the next segment that I wanted to talk about, which is in January 1991, you wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review called "Marketing is Everything."
You have that.
I have it. I have it here, and as I understand it, it has been for a long time one of the most requested reprints from the Harvard Business Review, and it's a very simple article. It's only, I've got the printout here, it's probably only 11 or 12 pages, but it really was a revolutionary way of thinking about marketing, and it seemed to make such an amazing impact at the time that it was published. I want to talk about that as, you know, both how it came about, Regis, and how it just is a wonderful distillation of so much of what you feel about marketing, and you just explained it. Can you talk about how the article came about and what the inspiration was for it?
Sure. Let me talk about some people that helped me with that, but also how the idea came about initially. This was at a time when again, Harvard Business Review traditionally really, people were either McKinsey or they were generally, again, an East Coast kind of publication, and you were either a Harvard professor or whatever. And it's when Ted Levitt, who was sort of the Peter, I think he was sort of alongside Peter Drucker in his knowledge of marketing and of business. And I met him through Businessland when he became an advisor to Businessland through the president, I guess, knew him, and Ted took over Harvard Business Review and decided to do something different. So he did interviews. He added cartoons, which really was shocked the world. I think when he put that, business cartoons into the review. And he had asked me to do a series of articles, and I don't know if this was the first or the second. And the managing editor was a guy named Alan Weber, and Alan was he was my editor, and so he worked with me on that article. I brought the idea and I wrote the original paper to him, and then gave it to him, and then we worked on it through time to kind of shape the the order and so forth. Alan, by the way, is now the mayor of Santa Fe, New Mexico. He retired. He also started Fast Company magazine, which I was one of the initial investors.
Such a fabulous magazine.
Yeah, and I got John Doerr to be an investor, and but I think I was one of his very earliest investors. But in any event, this came out of working on the whole quality movement that started here in the semiconductor industry, and was really all of these quality programs that were put into play, Theory Z and other kinds of things that came out of Japan, and Japan was looked at as the model, and it really was considered the reason why the semiconductor solid state memory really went to Japan, because they built higher quality parts than U.S. companies. And so TQM, total quality management, became sort of the watchword in the United States. It was the latest fad to go through, and every company had a total quality program. And so the idea of total quality, which was something that started with the board and went all the way down to the shipping clerk, that it had to be 100% in order to get all the awards or whatever that was presented to the government in quality, and you had to present a case on that. So this got me thinking about marketing is the same, that it's not a function within a company. I mean, in the quality business, there was a quality control manager, and I remember we had him in the early days of the semiconductor business. And before a product could be released, it had to go through the quality control manager, and he could say yes or no. And so it was one person who sort of got it out there. And then some of those functions were then transferred to the customer. And the customer would get prototypes, and they would stamp it yes or no. And they were the controller, they were the gatekeepers on whether or not you got a contract or not. And so now marketing was that way. Marketing was this function within a company that had certain functions to perform, and that was the function. I mean, it was responsible in various ways, but in the technology, and this marketing was really a sort of a fancy word for sales, and it really had to do with any types of advertising you do, any kinds of public relations, any types of sales literature, conferences, trade shows, all of those kinds of things, and the real marketing was product marketing. You know, those were the people who really could help shape, the technology to the outside world, or the interfaces, and had a voice inside and had a voice outside, and so thinking about that as applied to marketing, I began to, and Apple was beginning to become that kind of company in the early 90s. It was a company in which, well, it was that way. I think it was intended that way, up through and into the launch of the Mac. It sort of fell from grace in the following 10 years, but still in all, that idea that marketing is something everybody in the company should think about. Manufacturing people have to think of it in terms of quality. People who do design have to think about it in terms of ergonomics, in terms of ease of use, in terms of flexibility. So each one could define that role that they play in marketing differently. But still in all, it ends up being marketing, because if the quality of the manufacturing is there, you're not going to sell your product. You're not going to have it referred to. You're not going to have, you're going to have products in the marketplace that are your own worst enemy. The idea was the more you promote a bad product, the faster you go out of business. And that's true. The more you try to sell a defective product, the faster you go out of business. So. And again, maybe there's an example at Apple. That is the Lisa and the Apple III. They were defective, and the more they got out there, the more that reputation got out there. And so, there's so many things that go into creating a good market for your product and a good environment for that product, that it really involves everybody's job. The service, the way it's designed, the way you, what the company stands for, all of those things become part of that circle, and that circle then becomes marketing is everything.
There are so many striking things about the article. First of all, just the date. So it was published in the February 1991 issue of the Harvard Business Review, which means you were working on it during some period of 1990.
Right. Well, the idea came out over 3 or 4 years before that, yeah.
Before that. Tim Berners-Lee didn't even release his public version of the World Wide Web until June 1991.
Right.
The web didn't open to the general public for another 3 years after that. So this article predates what we now know the internet has enabled in marketing and consumer choice by at least 5 years and maybe even a decade by the time the web gets fully penetrated. And yet the third sentence in the article is technology is transforming choice and choice is transforming the marketplace. That is exactly what happened, and the whole article today reads as if it were written last week, just because of the world that we live in. Did you have an expectation that article would have an evergreen quality to it the way?
Well, there was actually two. The other one was real time.
Real time, yeah.
I just got a press release from a company that said, announcing, real time customer or real time software building or transfer of data into your disparate databases. And so, I mean, that term has now become, it's not that I invented that term, that was originally a military term, but it is kind of collective knowledge over particularly if you follow the technology. And in fact, I've always felt that marketing follows technology, it doesn't lead it. You had to have mass technology before you could have mass marketing. You couldn't have it the other way. Television and radio really expanded the marketing voice out there, but there was no feedback loop. And television didn't enhance that. It actually made it much more difficult to get feedback because it was so set in a time frame. And where this began to change, again, this was after the microprocessor. And so the ability to have infinitely programmable components meant that everything from closed design to airplanes were going to be constantly changing because of the ability to make these modular units and constantly adapt and alter them. So the idea of marketing is everything meant that marketing was going to become adapted to this because it followed previous technologies.
Yeah, and I think in addition to that, as you make clear here, the customer was going to be in charge.
Right.
And the feedback from the customer was going to be so pervasive and so brutal as the world became more customized that marketing couldn't be approached in the old way.
Yeah, and so why is Amazon successful? Because of the variety. So it's not just what they have in inventory, it's all the alliances and networks of retailers and products that they have that allows you to get almost an infinite variety of products from there. So it's saving you time and it offers variety. Yeah. One of the things that I did research on for maybe 30 years was the leading market share in almost every industry is other. And it's not any one brand, it's other. Who's the leading market share of beer in the world? It's other. It's not any other of the brands, and certainly that's true in bottled water. And it usually starts out in most industries that way. Certainly in the computer business it used to be that way, but as the industry matures and people become dominant, others fall by the wayside, and that becomes less true as industries, products develop, huge market capability, but there are other ways of doing things too that become competitors. So other is part of that idea, and that's what led me to a list of that the consumer doesn't follow a set of what was it? His hierarchy of needs.
Maslow's
hierarchy of needs, which a lot of the advertising used to base themselves on their promotion on. It's that with the rise of technology, consumer have preferences, and they change those preferences constantly. And that in hard times, brand becomes less important than price and choice. So we're constantly changing our preferences, just like we do with our computer. We change our preferences online to what kind of information we want, or what we want to prioritize, or whatever. So the consumer becomes much more in charge of how they see the world. But it used to be that everything was formulaic, and you paid attention to that. So the technology changed that. And it was the technology that allows you to say, well, here's how I think you have to respond to it. Now, I went so far in that article, take it to the next level, in saying that the real technology marketing person within a company is the CIO, the Chief Information Officer. And I gave, I don't know how many talks around the world to CIO organizations and computer industry groupings, giving that sort of presentation.
Did they stand up and cheer when you said that?
No, they were afraid of it. And a lot of them denied it. And I said, so what happens if the network's down in your company? What work gets done? Well, nothing gets done. I said, okay, so who's responsible for keeping the information flowing from your company to your distributors and dealers and retailers? And now online to the customer. Well, it's the CIO. And I said, yes. So you're as intimately involved in the marketing process as anybody in the organization. Let's imagine that you come out with some bad products and the company goes into a decline. Who gets fired? The CEO. And I said, so the chief marketing officer is the CEO, because he's the one that's ultimately responsible and whose job's on the line when things don't work. So when you start defining people's jobs and responsibilities, and also who at the end of the line is responsible for holding it together and gluing it together, and seeing that it's working on a consistent and real-time basis, then it's the CEO and the CIO, it's the C's in the organization. And so they should be intimately involved in the marketing process, because it involves all of the things that they're responsible for.
When you think of that 10-year period from 1990 to 2000, when you were seeing all of this really come into being in a really impactful, hard-hitting way, who do you think among your clients, whether they were pre-existing or you acquired them later, was the best at responding to that set of forces that you're talking about?
I think that certainly Intel did. I think under Andy Grove, and I think the program that he put together, the Crush program, in which there's a history here. There's recordings of the group, the Crush group. Jim Lally was in that group, by the way, and it was one of the leaders of that group. Bill Davidow was in that group. Dave House. So all people that you know and that were associated here with the museum. And I was involved in that group. I was the only outside member of Intel. But that brought people from all the different talents in the company together to try to devise a strategy to become dominant in the microprocessor business, when they were really clearly losing the design-in battle against Motorola. And I think it came to the realization that everybody in that company had a responsibility to stand up and fight. And the feedback as to how that got started in Grove was from the Northwest sales manager, regional manager at Intel. who wrote a memo to Grove about this, and so that stimulated it. So it came from down under, up, and then he pulled together people from different. I mean, to have me in there was, I think, sort of an innovation in a way, simply because he was asking for some outside view. And I'd become there. I was living there practically, so I was very much, and so were a lot of my people, part of the company. But still, in all, so many companies do these kind of things. We can't let anybody outside; it's too secretive. But they certainly did it. I think certainly the biggest example has to be Apple and Google, who have implemented these things throughout their business. It certainly gets them in trouble at times because they're trying to extend things out. That it's hard to keep things under control and under wraps. People go out now. They know who the parts suppliers are to all these companies. They know who their partners are. They know ex-employees. They know, so the network now it sometimes gets involved, but in fact, these companies are one who try to bring multiple parts of the company together to recognize and participate in the business. I can tell you one company that I think failed by not doing it, and that was Sony. And Sony was they were the worldwide example of a company that could take technology and miniaturize it and get it into consumer hands. From the Sony Walkman, the transistor radio, to the Sony Walkman became the ideal. And Steve Jobs constantly used the Walkman as an example of what he would like the Mac to be. That not meaning that's small, but being reproducible and used by everybody and easy to use.
And he finally got there with the iPhone.
And that had to do with because the technology all came together at that time. He could not have done it in '85. He had the vision we know very early, even in 1980. But the technology, the internet, the processors complexities, the memory technologies, the graphics engines, all of those kind of things, sensors, all of that came about at the same time, and it came to time at Apple. He could come back to Apple, but the Sony. When Steve came back to Apple, he was interviewed by Time magazine, and he said in this article, "We want to become the digital Sony." And I thought about that, and I said, yeah. Now, why didn't Sony do it? Because they had everything but the digital. Xerox, back east, they had everything but the digital. Kodak, they had everything but the digital. If you think about that, they were not looking to the new technologies as being the driving force for social change, for the way the consumers bought things and looked at things and used things. They were simply trying to milk the system that had been around for generations. And that was also the old consulting model. Stick with that high right into the curve, which is, mature products that give better margins on and makes you money. But the products down here is what makes you a lot of money. And even at HP, they didn't quite listen to that, because there was a study they did there trying to think of the guy, he was the head of R&D, told me this, that I think it was every 3 years or every 5 years, their product line was completely replaced by a new generation. Their customer and their product base completely turned around to that new generation. So it took some time. And so they knew that technology worked along that. If it wasn't Moore's law, it was some law that said things are going to change and become exponentially different in the marketplace, even in perception.
And that's a very short cycle.
It's a very short cycle, and those cycles changed in the 80s. And that changed because of the microprocessor and programmable technologies and software that allowed you to actually change things more rapidly, from your manufacturing lines to your individual product design to modularity, You know, when you go to have your car serviced today, they just take out one module and put in another. They don't even, I bought a, this was, again, back in, I think, the early 90s. I bought a new car, and it was problems with it. I took it into the dealer. Guy went into the shop. The guy opened up the hood, and he looked at this manager, and he said, "Do you know where the computer is in this thing?" He didn't even know, you know? I mean, no, if it had been the old one, he would have just, you know, looked at the battery. He would have looked at the pistons. I don't know what it was, but he would just look at the mechanical parts and the electromechanical parts. But cars are all software today, and they're, you know, when they first began being, you know, a lot of the functions being managed by a computer, people didn't know how to service them, so they built them modularly. And so this is how you can have multiple brands and multiple varieties of because they're all built on set pieces that can change individually, but work like I called it the Rubik's Cube of technology. These pieces can be moved and shaped, but they all can end up in something different and customizable for the customer. So this is how you got to think about how the future is going to be. It's going to become, you know, one large Rubik's Cube in which the technology is going to constantly reshape itself and put more of that capability into the hands of the user and less into the hands of the manufacturer.
And that's exactly what this article said.
Right.
Well ahead of its time. Yeah. Just in time for, probably behind time for you, right? You were probably thinking this is overdue, but it's still today. When I read it, it's just stunning how forward-looking it is.
I still get just recently call interviews on
it. In this same time period, AOL was starting to emerge as a company, and you did some early work for AOL.
Right.
Can you talk a bit about your experience with them as a company and the context in which that happened?
Going to work for AOL, again, the marketplace, there was a company called Prodigy, which was an early one. There were a number of, companies. Prodigy was then became a joint venture with IBM and Sears. I was brought into a meeting with the president of IBM and some others. I don't know how that happened, but I was invited back and to sit in a session in which they were evaluating that. So I had a little bit of experience in that world. The founder, the real founder, was a guy not Steve, but called Jim Kimsey. McKinsey, was it McKinsey or no, not McKinsey? It was called Jim Kimsey, I think his name.
Yeah, it was Jim Kimsey.
Yeah, and Jim went to the. I think he went to the either went to the Naval Academy or he went to one of the military. Where did he go? He went to, he was in the service anyway with Frank Caulfield. And at West Point, I think it might have been West Point where he went, and Frank went there too. And he approached Frank, Jim Kimsey, about this company and about getting it financed. And because it was sort of, they thought more of going to be a marketing company, Frank asked me to go on the board, and I didn't. I was doing a lot of traveling. I said I don't want to go back to Virginia once a month or even more than that. But I'll, we'll take them on as a client. I can help them that way, which I did. And so my first involvement, Steve was really the marketing guy. And but McKinsey thought that he would retire, and he put Steve in charge, and he became the sort of COO or CEO. And they were struggling again to raise money, so it wasn't so much as the traditional job for us of trying to help prepare literature and promotion and that sort of thing. It was really a lot of strategic thinking. And one of the things that came up was to um, to essentially license the product to Apple, and Apple was trying to get into that business at the time, and
was the idea that AOL would come bundled as a service with the hardware?
Yeah.
You would buy the hardware and get an AOL subscription.
That was sort of the idea, but I think the main reason that they were willing to do it was because they needed money. And certainly the venture provided, but it was sort of a business that was foreign to most venture firms. You know, today, obviously, everybody does anything that's online and so forth, but then that was really, the internet was still in the future, really, the full bandwidth of the internet. You had to have a modem. You used dial-up as a means, one of the companies we worked with was one of the early modem companies. It was out of Georgia, and it was sort of one of the dominant modem companies. And so I went down there and worked with them a lot. So I had again, the periphery stuff I was involved in, and so that was really where I was helping, just sort of be something to bounce ideas off, build strategy off of with Steve, and I helped him, introduced him to Apple. Apple was going to pay them a lot of money to license that, and he was hesitant as to whether or not he really should do it, because Apple built a product that was actually an online sort of a fantasy world of some sort, where they would use their products for the Apple II. For you could build sites and sessions and have sort of group games and all that sort of thing together. And
there was a lot of development going on at that time by all these companies.
Yeah.
I mean, just think of the companies you've named, IBM and Sears and Apple and GE had a product,
right.
And there were a number of companies we wouldn't necessarily think of today as getting into that business, but everybody could see something was about to happen.
Right, and so this is true with most technology. It was true with the personal computer. There was enough stuff going on in the marketplace that if you step back and really think about it and you know, had a little bit of experience, you could sort of see it happening. And certainly, you know, I'll just go back to Intel, for example. The first computer, the Altair, which was sort of a box with switches on the front and nothing like, but they called it a personal computer. They didn't call it a personal computer, but they called it a hobby computer. And the first two products that were sold in that way had 8080 processors in it, and we used them as applications at Intel as potential marketplaces. So I was already involved in understanding that term. So Apple, people feel that somehow or other I walked in and I turned Apple down because they were, you know, they were something new. It wasn't that case at all. It was the case that I didn't think they wanted to listen to what we had to offer, and that didn't change. But again, back to AOL, and really, they were able to sell that technology to Apple, and I was very much involved in that. I got calls all day long, weekend, nights from Steve.
Steve Case?
Yeah, Steve Case, because he was hesitant to do it. And by the way, Steve's Case had a brother that was a financial analyst out here in San Francisco. I think he was at Montgomery or maybe one of the big investment banking firms, then big out here. A really fantastic guy, and really covered the technology industry and was really a good person. Died very young. But Steve was hesitant to do it because he thought, you know, you don't give up your key technology. But Apple, just because of Apple and its problems, it was never able to really focus on that. It became sort of a side project, and I did work with the people on Apple on that and marketing it. But they just never were able to give it the kinds of attention as they were selling computers, they weren't selling software solutions and games and services, and they didn't do it very well in those days anyway. So while they paid for the license to do that, they never really ended up fulfilling it. And I think just because of the distance, we kind of lost daily involvement with it as we did here, companies in Silicon Valley. And you know, Don Valentine used to say he wouldn't invest in a company that he couldn't get to and back in one day on a plane. He's got a bigger plane, maybe he can go further, but I think in those days that was kind of from here to Dallas and back.
Were you surprised that AOL went on to do what it did based on what you saw of the company and Steve Case?
No, I think they did a lot of experimentation. You know, they packaged the early program discs with cookies and gave them out on airplanes. They did some really unique and different things. And the fellow the fellow who came in, and I think they were acquired. It was an ad agency back there, similar to ours. In fact, he used to, you know, said he was copying us or we were copying him. I don't know what. He was acquired by AOL, and he go on. I think he owns one of the big sports teams back there now, so he did pretty well by going in and helping them implement and doing their marketing programs.
Oh, was this Ted Leonsis?
Yeah,
was that
Ted
the guy
Leonsis was an ad agency guy.
Okay, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. He does. He owns most of the sports teams in Washington.
Yeah, yeah. And that all came from, you know, doing ads.
Let's talk about that period from 1995 to 2000 now, where you're trying to figure out what to do with the business and as a company and with you personally. What were the things that were going through your mind at the time and the context?
With respect to my own firm, 1995 was sort of a good year to pick because it was the year in which I began to sell off portions of what we called PR, which was largely dealing with the media and you know, dealing with the press and the analysts and so forth, to sort of concentrate on the consulting business. The consulting business had grown somewhere between probably 5 and 10 million, but the PR business was around, at that time, it had been declining. It was about 5 million. And so the idea was to sort of get rid of it. Plus, I made a comment that, as I said, came back to haunt me a bit, and it was in the Wall Street Journal in which I said PR is dead.
What was your thinking behind that?
Yeah, the idea was certainly looking at the internet and saying the journalist doesn't have to rely on intermediaries anymore. They can go direct to sources. They can go direct to third parties. So the internet becomes the flow of information in which you know, people can control their own, and companies can go on the internet, create their own blogs, their own newsletters, their own so forth, and communicate directly to their customers and or the public or analysts. And so, and quite frankly, as companies grew, they wanted to control. I think there's always been this need for companies to control somehow or other the media. And so they bring that in-house, thinking that will control it. It really doesn't. It makes them, I think, more vulnerable because people internally are known to be intellectually captive and compromised. And so the external people, if they maintain their integrity, can act as more independent, and more references are accumulated that way. But some of our companies, and particularly Intel, started moving more and more stuff in-house. We had, I don't know, maybe at some point 20, 25 people working on Intel worldwide. But they really wanted to control all those functions themselves. And no amount of discussion or argument would overcome that. It had to do with, in my mind, you know, Andy Grove was a very control-oriented person, and this function was no different to him than any other conditions in which he had, you know, certain goals and objectives, and you carry them out or you don't work anymore. And so,
well, and you've referred to that in earlier segments of
yeah,
the history
and
too.
I had,
It was an ongoing theme with him.
and I had ongoing sometimes arguments with him over that. But it's inevitable. You don't have control over that, and so companies, you know, they take control of that, and I think that today that it's helping to I think weaken the whole idea that somehow or the media is the voice or can be trusted, because there is already this sort of built-in distrust of the media. As being people who are publishing things that they have their own personal views on, or they're colored by some other view of the world than they have, and so at least the outside PR firms, if they really were independent, they could essentially begin to convince both sides that it's better for them. For example, when companies get into trouble, the best thing is to go out and admit it and get it over with. You know, when you're truly significant things happen, get it out there, get into the news, satisfy the media from the standpoint of getting as much information as they can, and it goes away. Whereas if you try to hide it, you try to stonewall it, you try to put a flavor on it that doesn't exist, it lasts forever. And so this is just human nature. It's not any deep kind of intellectual thought. So all of those kinds of things, there were certainly then still need to get media out, even to do train. Some of our people were doing training of executives on how to speak publicly, how to work with the media, all those kind of things. So all of those kinds of functions we had. But when I said PR is dead, I really did mean that the internet was taking over those functions and would continue to expand in taking them over, and that certainly, you know, many of the things that you hear about leaks out of the industry come from within companies. Almost all of it. People know about things very instantaneously, and it's not that anybody is going out and having a meeting with anybody. It's that they have access to the internet, and they can set up an account at home, or they can do it wherever they want. And so it's also a major issue in the world, but it is in fact the reality that intermediaries, they call it disintermediation, was taking place in that business, and that I didn't see a future in it. For us anyway, not the kinds of things that we did. And companies want to also maintain their own strategy and their own input, and they would, and as you got into more and more proprietary kinds of things, they wanted to keep that within solid walls. So there was always a suspicion of anybody that was outside, particularly if you sat in strategy meetings and marketing meetings and all of those kinds of things. So
well, and all of that's proven to be true, Regis.
Oh yeah,
that's exactly what's happened.
Yeah, and
in fact, companies have taken the next step and become their own media companies.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the largest ad agency in the world is Google. I actually back when my book Real Time came out, which was in the early '90s, gave a talk at Procter & Gamble in front of its management, including the president and all their high executives, on that very subject, on real time. And when I finished, I got the president at the time asked me, did I think that their ad agency would become a software company? And I said, yeah, I think that's very likely. That's very precedent of you to say that, because that's where I see it going. And indeed, it was. And I didn't know that Google was coming. I just knew that the internet was going to have revolutionary changes, and that it would, particularly in the communications area. So the idea of how do we make money in the future, and I happen to be, we worked alongside consulting firms, in some instances with McKinsey or with other consulting firms, and you know, they seem to get either, you know, higher return for simply an idea or a thought, and I felt that, so, you know, I raised our rates, and when we gave advice, we didn't give it away quite as easily as we did before.
Well, given what we just talked about your 1991 essay and marketing being everything, and the reasons that was going to happen, you must have also seen the very close relationship between what was going to happen with PR and what was going to happen with marketing in a world where you could get immediate, instant feedback from consumers on everything.
Yeah, and I'm not plugging these, but I wrote 2 books in a row and had a very similar topic. The one, real time, was the impact that real time technologies, the ability to gather information, analyze it, and feed it back to the marketplace in literally, seconds, or now it's even under seconds. That would revolutionize marketing. That people would be able to, and actually the idea came from, it was some article written by an economist back, I think it was right in 1900, when he said the telegraph was a marvelous device because you could order goods from as far away as Australia and have them delivered to your doorstep by simply sending a simple message. Well, you think about that, and I actually have built a chart that showed the different ways of communicating and the speeds with which it happened. So the first one was really the Pony Express and the amount of information, the average mail that people got per day, and all the way down to the railroad, to television, radio, and then down to electronics. And so on that chart, it showed, going from weeks and 2 or 3 letters a month to hundreds, thousands, and now millions of messages per second. And so the speed with which things travel and the time with which it takes increases exponentially the output. And so the book Real Time was really about that, about how the world's changing just because of everything being instantaneous. And then the next book I wrote was called Total Access. And that idea was that access is replacing broadcast. That, it used to be that you would have a dozen major channels on your television. And so my question to audiences used to be, how many channels are there on the internet? And there are tens of millions. All you need is an address, right? I mean, just like a phone number. But that address is already built into the software, so you have access to millions and millions of different sources of information or products or technologies or alliances or whatever. And so access really replaces broadcast. We don't sit around wait for a program to come on TV. We record it, or we watch it on our iPhone, or synopsis of it on our iPhone the next day or a day later or a week later. Somebody says to you, oh, did you see, more common one anymore is, did you see that skit on Saturday Night Live, last night or last week? You can just go on and get it on TV. You don't have to be there to watch it. And so that's where access controls broadcast. And broadcast is time and space limited, where the internet is not. And that, again, behind that is the processor, real-time technologies, networking, increased bandwidth, the increased speeds of the network, all of those kinds of things. So, looking at technology can really tell you how the world's being shaped, both positive and negative.
And so here you are in 1995, seeing all of this on the horizon. You sold most of the bits of the PR business off, and you're thinking about the future. What was your thinking at that time?
Well, I think I was back to being sort of a boutique consultant.
But you're almost a startup again, aren't you?
Well, I think the business was restarted about three or four times throughout the time. I mean, getting rid of, whenever I got rid of the Pete Marwick Alliance, we had to start over, pretty much, and getting into really getting out of the PR business into another. That was, but we had a foothold there. It wasn't a big one, but we had a foothold. But we were able to actually build substantial, I mean, millions of dollars of business with IBM after that. And it was on things like their small servers. That was a division that we started working with. We also were able to work with there was a whole sort of a new technology that was coming out that the companies here, that BEA and others were getting into, that IBM was trying to get into, and we worked with them on that. I attended meetings back with IBM in their management circles on how to prepare for changing the company and what new technologies they were coming out with and where they might focus their attention and energy. This all came about because Jack Keeler, who was president of IBM at the time, well, actually a little bit later, but Jack was on the trustees, board of trustees at Santa Clara University, where he got his undergraduate degree. He was the only president of IBM that was an engineer, and he was known as the engineer's engineer because he was sort of one of these people that tried to build an elite class of engineers at IBM and really defended the engineering, you know, down to that tabletop. And he had the respect and admiration of the project. So I got involved with some projects down at their Almaden labs, and got to probably work with some people down there that really were thinking about this, the impact on society. I learned a great deal there. I participated in a number of programs. They had a program that was, they brought in their IBM customers, their end user customers, their big customers, Bank of America and so forth, and various financial firms and in industries, and gave them a presentation on the future of their technologies. And I was a speaker at that several times. They then started a thing called what was it called? The science of services. So they began looking at, you know, the world is becoming more service oriented. In fact, if you look at agriculture, manufacturing, and services, the services sector is the dominant industry in the world, and that isn't. There's a sort of a category for the services like McDonald's and those kind of things, but these are financial services, medical services, and so forth. It is most of the things that come through your iPhone little window there are services. Google's a service company, eBay's a service company, believe it or not, Apple is a service company. So most of the bigger companies in the Valley today are service companies, or they are creating platforms for services. Oracle and Cisco. These are companies that are creating the means for services to exchange value or to hold platforms for creating new services to your customers. So they have a huge research program there on the science of services. How do people learn? How do they learn new things? What happens to the interface? All of these kinds of things. And I got to know the president down there, or the guy that was running it very well. He was transferred to another research operation, but we spent a lot of time together, and you know, it was sort of a PhD in science for me in an area that I liked, and I myself had studied and gathered a lot of my files on service marketing back to the 70s, and there was a woman called Lynn Shostak, who was the first vice president of marketing at Citibank, first woman to achieve that position. And she became a consultant to a lot of service companies throughout the world. And she had a particular presentation. I read some of her early articles were on product marketing versus service marketing and how different they are, and how a product is different than a service. But then I was getting into software, which was a service and a product. Yes. And so it becomes a hybrid, but it isn't tangible. You can't see it, you can't feel it. It's hard, you know, and so forth, like you can a tangible product. And so that was an area that became very unique to me in trying to understand and study. So it's this constant learning with the technology so you can adapt to what's going on as things emerge in the new world. And I started doing that early, and I just loved doing it. And sometimes it turned into a good business, and sometimes it didn't.
There's a great quote from your one of your essays about 1995, which was your 25th year in business. It said, and you wrote this: "We forced change on ourselves. We didn't have to go through all these changes. Not everyone can deal with change. Our culture is one that says we must strive to be more than we are today. We are never content with the status quo. This is what makes us unique and why people like to come to work." That, I think, is a pretty profound statement about your company and your culture at the time.
Yeah, and that was pretty much the business plan.
How did you manage to find people who were so open to change? Most people don't like change.
I think as you get along, there are people who have been with you who have done it along the way with me. There are also, as you go, you're hiring younger people coming into the company who are much more adept to the change and have grown up in a changing culture, and they are much more willing to deal in that kind of an environment and have a better understanding of it. One of the first things that, when I went to see Steve after he had gone back to Apple, he invited me over to lunch. I think it was like maybe he had been there a year already, and they haven't gotten sort of the public image of change. It took about 2 years for him to really get out there with the new products that change things. But he said that the average age of the Apple employee is now, I think he said something like 25 or 30, where it was like 50 under the old regime. And so he said, by having all those young people you have coming out of school, out of college, they're into this environment. They're part of it. They understand it better than others. And so keeping either associating with young people or being and getting them into your business and constantly sort of rejuvenating your business with new, bright young people coming out. Engineers coming out of school today certainly are learning. If you went into electrical engineering in 1950, the people that came out in 1960 have a much greater advantage of you because of the changes that have occurred. In 1950, you were working with electromechanical systems. Certainly by the 70s, you're working with electronic systems almost entirely. I go back to my first employer in the publishing world who had a magazine called Systems Design, one called Medical Electronic News. This was in the 50s. He had electronic systems design. Those were things that people weren't thinking about, and he was writing about these because he said this is what's coming next. And so even our luncheon meetings with the journalists then, who are the editors, they were people who were thinking about the next thing and the next thing. At the time, I remember having a whole luncheon discussion about future cars and that the fossil fuel systems were going to kill us. And how would we replace the car? And there was a big debate on what kind of cars would they build, and things like that. So these were people who were constantly stimulating to thinking about tomorrow. So I think I've been very fortunate to not only be with firms like that, Intel, Apple, and certainly dozens and dozens of others, from the inception. That were thinking that way and trying to build that businesses around that concept.
What finally led you to plan an exit to the business in 2000, and how did you go about that?
Well, it wasn't easy because we had recruiting firms trying to find somebody to run the business, and those were all failures. You can't bring somebody from the outside into an organization like this that had been sort of for 30 years built on, basically one driver and one identification. It's very hard to maintain people.
Would you, let me just interject a question here. Would you have wanted that if the right person had come along? Did you have a picture in your mind of the perfect person, and if that person had been discovered, that would have been a good fit?
Yeah, I had people. I mean, I had some, I had people in the company who probably could have done it. In fact, I had more women that would have done it. But by then we had formed these partners, and there was probably half a dozen. No, there was probably maybe 10 partners. They would never buy into it.
So structurally, the way the ownership was shared among these partners, it just couldn't have worked.
Yeah, but even after I shared the art, they didn't want to do it. Even when each of them owned equal shares and had more shares than I did as a cumulative group, they didn't want to do it. And they did. I mean, it's hard running a business. I mean, I've heard Steve Jobs wax on this, and he says, I don't understand how anybody can even be married and start and run a business today in this environment, because he says it's really hard, and he emphasizes that. And it is. If you're giving 100% of your time and effort and a lot of your family life to that, to sustaining it. And I'd done it for 30 years. I was certainly happy where I was. I was involved in investing in companies and on boards, and I was doing quite well there. So it wasn't something that I did by necessity, and particularly when you find that you've got a position where, but it's going to take another revolution to get into the next change and the next level of businesses. So along came people like Google and Facebook and all of these kinds of companies before all that happened, but they were not out there, I think, and not able to get into those kinds of businesses and industries because their networks didn't keep moving out. And to just do networking is a full-time job. I mean, lunches, dinners, meetings, a lot of wasted time with meetings that you're probably never going to see any production out of. And going in and hearing presentations, and because everybody's kicking tires, some stick, some don't. Some of them take your ideas from those meetings and don't call you back. And I know of a few that did that. I know more than a few that did that. The whole idea of the influence network is probably used in almost every technology business today that has a communications firm working with them.
Yeah. And they, so you had a search, you looked for a successor, and it sounded like you were hoping to replicate the model you had, which is you leading the business and thinking of a future where it wasn't Regis McKenna, but it was someone else who could plug in and take it forward.
Yeah. I would prefer that be somebody internally. And we did try outsiders, and they just miserably failed, and really hurt the business rather than helped it. And so that experimentation was a disaster. And so the whole idea of just giving the shares and saying, it's yours.
Take it
and do what you will.
Can. Yeah.
And just sort of fading into the sunset.
In retrospect, how do you think that worked?
Well, I think for the individuals, I think it worked well. I think everybody, all of the partners certainly ended up on their feet doing very well for themselves. And most of them are still around. Some of them are individual consultants. Some have started businesses. Some have gone into venture and other types of businesses. So I think individually, I think it did well. Having sat on board of directors in which I've had firms like wannabe firms like ours come in and give presentations, I've never seen anything that sort of approached it the way we did. I remember sitting on a board in which the advertising manager, marketing communications manager, whatever it was called, came in and said, Regis, you're going to love this. And because they just saw everything that was promotional or whatever was me and was our firm, but they never really looked closely. And what their firm was proposing was putting the name of the company on spaceships that went out of the government in Texas, or in Florida rather, and having the name on the side of a rocket, and those kind of things. Or going on television, which I was totally against most technologies going on television because they're reaching an audience that's not their customers, by and large. Most of their customers were business to business. And yet, and then there's a point at which you don't fight it anymore. So it's not just all fun and games. You are fighting to get done what you want done. From the first time I was doing ads, several times I agreed to pay for the ad if it wasn't successful myself, when I couldn't afford that, to constantly fighting for sort of a better way or a better approach or something that wasn't specsmanship. And so if you really want to move forward, you got to fight for it. And there, I think 30 years I have a lot of bruises and made a lot of really good friends. Just a lot of what I learned, what I loved doing, which was learning, and absorbing that. And I think I have nothing to complain about whatsoever.